My name is Chloe. I am 28 years old, and I work as an administrative accountant. My story does not start with a fairy tale romance or a long explanation of my childhood. It begins in the freezing delivery room of Seattle General Hospital. I had just endured 14 hours of blinding pain, bringing my daughter Lily into the world. I was exhausted, my body was trembling uncontrollably, and I was desperate for the comfort of the man I married. But instead of tears of joy or a loving embrace, I found myself staring at a harsh and undeniable reality. My husband Jason is 30 years old. He stood as far away from the hospital bed as the walls would allow. He was not looking at me. He was not looking at his newborn daughter. He was staring intently at his phone screen. There is no need for lengthy descriptions of our past. I do not need to walk you through the months of empty promises. I do not need to explain how he always made convenient excuses about being too busy with work to attend a single ultrasound. The reality of my marriage was standing right in front of me in that hospital room. The fluorescent lights buzzed above us. The nurses were bustling around cleaning up and checking my vitals. And the man who was supposed to be my partner in life looked like he was waiting for a bus to arrive. The journey to this moment had been a lonely one. For 9 months, I had carried the physical and emotional weight of our child entirely on my own shoulders. Every morning, I woke up feeling the heavy ache in my back and the persistent nausea in my stomach. Every morning, Jason put on his tailored suits, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the door with a quick kiss on my cheek that felt more like a habit than an expression of love. When I tried to talk to him about the baby room, the crib, or the tiny clothes we needed to buy, he would wave his hand dismissively. He would say he trusted my judgment and that he was simply too swamped with upcoming quarterly reports to think about paint colors. I accepted his answers because I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that his distance was just the typical anxiety of a first-time father. I convinced myself that the moment he saw our baby, everything would change. I told myself that the profound miracle of life would break through his walls and remind him of the family we were building together. But sitting in that delivery room, the truth was impossible to ignore. The 14 hours of labor had been a solitary nightmare. When the contractions first started the previous night, I had to shake him awake. He groaned, rubbed his eyes, and complained about a morning meeting he was going to miss. During the drive to Seattle General Hospital, he spent the entire time on a hands-free call complaining to a colleague about a delayed shipment. He did not hold my hand. He did not offer words of encouragement. While I squeezed my eyes shut and breathed through the agonizing waves of pain, he was adjusting the volume on his car stereo. Once we were admitted and assigned a room, his detachment only grew worse, as the hours dragged on and the pain intensified. Jason retreated to the uncomfortable vinyl chair in the corner of the room. He brought his laptop. The rhythmic sound of my heart monitor was constantly accompanied by the rapid clicking of his keyboard. The nurses came and went, offering me ice chips, adjusting my pillows, and holding my hand when the contractions peaked. Strangers provided the warmth and support that my own husband withheld. When the final stage of labor began, and the room filled with medical staff, Jason stood up, but he did not come to my side. He moved to the back wall, his arms crossed over his chest, watching the entire process, with the detached curiosity of a man inspecting a damaged vehicle at his mechanic shop. And then she was here. The doctor announced the time of birth and placed Lily on my chest. She was warm, wet, and crying with a beautiful, loud voice that filled the sterile room with life. The overwhelming rush of maternal love I felt for her was instant and absolute. It was a fierce, protective instinct that settled deep into my bones. I looked down at her tiny red face, her little fingers grasping at the air, and I knew I would do anything to keep her safe. I shifted my weight on the hospital bed, fighting through the lingering pain and the extreme fatigue that threatened to pull me under. I looked across the room at Jason. I expected him to step forward. I expected the laptop to be pushed aside. I expected the business facade to crumble. I begged him to come closer. I asked Jason to come and hold our daughter. He looked up from his phone for a fraction of a second. His face did not soften. His eyes did not well up with the emotion you expect from a new father. Instead, his expression twisted into a mixture of irritation and deep anxiety. He physically backed away. He took an actual step backward towards the heavy wooden door of the delivery room. He shook his head quickly and claimed he was afraid of dropping the baby. I stared at him. The excuse hung in the quiet room completely absurd and hollow. Mothers and fathers hold their children every single day. I had just gone through 14 hours of absolute physical agony, and I was holding her just fine. But Jason kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding my gaze completely. He kept checking his watch. He checked it once, then twice, then a third time in the span of a single minute. The nurses noticed his behavior. I saw the attending nurse exchange a quick pitying glance with the doctor. That look from a stranger hurt more than the physical pain of childbirth. It confirmed that I was not overreacting. It confirmed that this was not normal. A deep conflict erupted in my chest. This was supposed to be the most important day of our lives. I asked him again, my voice rough and cracking from the screaming I had done an hour earlier. I told him he needed to come sit down. I told him she was perfectly safe, and he would not drop her. Jason let out a loud, frustrated sigh. He rubbed his forehead like I was asking him to solve a massive logistical crisis, instead of holding his own flesh and blood. He looked at his phone again, and the screen lit up with a new notification. I saw his posture change instantly. The nervous energy turned into a frantic need to escape. He looked at me, his voice totally devoid of warmth, and said he needed to step outside right now. He claimed he had to make an urgent call to a business partner. A business partner. My mind repeated the words as if trying to translate a foreign language. My daughter was barely an hour old. I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to intravenous lines and monitors. I was bleeding and exhausted, and my husband was walking out the door to call a business partner. I watched his back as he pushed the heavy door open. He did not look back at me. He did not say he loved us. He did not say he would be right back. He just walked out into the hallway and let the door swing shut behind him. The sound of that door clicking shut echoed loudly in my mind. It was the sound of a curtain falling on the illusion of my marriage. For 9 months I had made excuses for him. I told myself he was just stressed about finances. I told myself his job was demanding, and he was working hard to provide a stable future for our growing family. I swallowed the bitter disappointment every time I sat in the waiting room at the obstetrician clinic, surrounded by couples looking at ultrasound printouts together, while I sat alone pretending to read a magazine. I had rationalized his absence, his coldness, and his constant attachment to his phone. But sitting in that delivery room, holding my beautiful and apparently unwelcome child, the blindfold finally fell off. I realized in that exact moment that you cannot force someone to care. You cannot beg for basic human decency from someone who views your existence as an obligation. The physical pain in my body was intense, but the mental clarity I gained was sharper than a surgical scalpel. I looked down at Lily. Her tiny fingers were curled into loose fists against my skin. She was completely dependent on me. She had no one else in this room, no one else in this world, who would put her needs first. If her father could not find the basic decency to hold her on the very day she was born, I knew I would have to be strong enough for the both of us. The nurse stepped forward and gently adjusted the warm blanket around my shoulders. She had a kind face, weathered by years of watching families begin, and sometimes break in this very room. She asked me in a soft, careful voice if I needed anything. I looked at the closed door where my husband had just vanished. Then I looked at the nurse and told her I was going to be perfectly fine. I did not cry for him. I refused to waste a single tear on a man who prioritized a mysterious phone call over his newborn child. Instead, a cold and quiet resolution began to build inside my chest. The naive, hopeful woman who had walked into this hospital hoping for a perfect family was gone forever. In her place was a mother who was finally paying attention. If Jason was outside talking to a business partner, I was going to find out exactly what kind of business he was conducting. I did not know yet what I would uncover. I did not know about the hidden secrets, the drained accounts, or the devastating truths that were waiting for me to discover them. But as I held Lily close to my heart and listened to her steady breathing, I made a silent promise to her. I would never let anyone treat us like a burden again. The battle lines were drawn the moment that door closed, and I was not going to let us be the victims of this story. I closed my eyes and let the reality of the situation wash over me. The exhaustion was pulling at my consciousness, but my mind was racing with questions. Who was he really calling? Why was he so anxious to leave the room? Why did his phone constantly require his attention during the most critical moments of our lives? The excuses he had fed me for the past year suddenly tasted like ashes. The late nights at the office, the sudden weekend business trips, the passwords changed on our shared accounts under the guise of corporate security protocols. I had been blindly trusting a man who treated his family like a waiting room he was forced to sit in. I opened my eyes and looked at the clock on the hospital wall. 10 minutes had passed since he walked out. 10 minutes of silence from the hallway. He was not rushing back. He was not pacing anxiously outside the door, waiting to return to his wife and child. He was gone. The nurse returned with a small cup of water and a sympathetic smile. She did not ask where my husband was. She did not need to. The staff in this hospital had seen every kind of human behavior, and Jason's absence spoke volumes. I took the cup, my hands remarkably steady, and drank the cold water. I felt a renewed sense of strength filtering through my veins. It was not the strength of a happy wife, but the fierce, unyielding strength of a mother who realizes she is the only line of defense her child has. I looked down at Lily again. Her eyes were closed, completely unaware of the coldness her father had just shown her. She would never know this feeling of rejection if I could help it. I would shield her from his indifference. I would be the warmth she needed, the attention she deserved, and the love she was promised. Jason had made his choice clear. He had chosen his phone, his excuses, and his mysterious business partner over us. And in doing so, he had unknowingly given me the greatest gift of all. He had given me the clarity to see him for exactly who he was. The next few hours were a blur of medical checks and quiet moments with my daughter. The pediatrician came in to examine her, declaring her perfectly healthy and strong. I memorized every detail of her face, the curve of her tiny nose, the soft fuzz of hair on her head. I was entirely consumed by the miracle of her existence. When Jason finally returned to the room nearly an hour later, the atmosphere had permanently shifted. He walked in holding a cup of terrible hospital coffee, his phone safely tucked away in his pocket. He forced a stiff smile and asked how we were doing, his voice lacking any genuine emotion. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. I did not yell. I did not demand to know who he had been talking to for an hour. I simply smiled a cold, polite smile and told him we were doing great. I told him he did not need to worry about holding her right now because she was resting. I watched the visible relief wash over his face, a reaction that solidified everything I had realized while he was gone. He was relieved to be let off the hook. He was relieved to not have to play the role of the loving father. He sat back down in the vinyl chair, opened his laptop, and resumed his typing. The room returned to the rhythmic sounds of the monitors and the quiet breathing of my newborn baby. But nothing was the same. The foundation of my marriage had cracked and shattered entirely. I was lying in a hospital bed, physically weak, but mentally preparing for the war that was surely coming. I did not know the details of the betrayal yet, but I knew the truth was hiding in plain sight, likely on the very device he was staring at. I was no longer the supportive, unquestioning wife. I was a mother on a mission, and I was going to uncover every single lie he had ever told me. The discovery was coming, and when it did, I would be ready to strike back. The heavy wooden door of my hospital room swung open with a sudden violence that made me flinch. I had just managed to get my breathing under control. The exhaustion of a 14-hour labor was settling deep into my muscles, pulling me toward a sleep I desperately needed. Lily was a warm, fragile weight against my chest, finally resting after her traumatic entry into the world. But any hope for peace shattered the second my mother-in-law crossed the threshold. Brenda did not knock. She did not enter with the soft reverence people usually reserve for maternity wards. She stormed into the room like a woman running out of time. I had spent the last 3 years trying to earn Brenda's approval. I endured her backhanded compliments about my modest background. I swallowed my pride when she casually mentioned that her son could have married the daughter of a real estate tycoon. I hosted every holiday dinner, baked her favorite desserts, and smiled until my cheeks ached while she critiqued my housekeeping. I did all of it because I believed that family was supposed to stick together. I believed that if I just proved my devotion, she would eventually see me as a daughter. But as Brenda practically ran across the sterile linoleum floor, the truth of our relationship was laid bare. She did not look at the hospital bed. She did not glance at the tiny swaddled newborn resting in my arms. She completely ignored the fact that her first official grandchild had just been born. Her eyes, wide and frantic, were locked entirely on Jason. I watched her through heavy eyelids. The medication and the exhaustion made the room feel slightly surreal, like I was watching a scene unfold underwater. I saw her reach him. She did not offer a congratulatory hug. She did not shed a tear of joy. Instead, her manicured hands reached out and seized the fabric of his expensive dress shirt. Her knuckles were white. She pulled him close, her face inches from his, and hissed a question that would echo in my mind for the rest of my life. That baby, did he survive? The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My mind scrambled, desperate to make sense of a sentence that belonged in a nightmare, not a maternity ward. That baby, did he survive? I did not gasp. I did not sit up and demand to know what she was talking about. A primal survival instinct, older and deeper than conscious thought, took over my body. I let my head loll slightly to the side. I allowed my breathing to slow into a deep, rhythmic pattern. I closed my eyes entirely, presenting the perfect picture of an exhausted mother who had finally succumbed to sleep. But beneath my closed eyelids, my brain was firing on all cylinders. I was an accountant. My entire career was built on finding anomalies, tracking discrepancies, and uncovering the truth hidden in complex spreadsheets. Now I was turning that analytical focus onto my own life. Jason let out a harsh, frustrated breath. He pulled her hands off his shirt and stepped back. His voice was a low, angry rumble, meant only for her ears, but the quiet of the hospital room carried every syllable straight to me. "Keep your voice down," he snapped. "She is sleeping." I heard Brenda let out a shaky breath. "I do not care if she is sleeping," she whispered sharply. "I need to know what is happening down there." He ran a hand over his face. The sound of his palm against his rough stubble was agonizingly loud. "It was bad," he muttered. The premature birth caused massive complications. They had to take him to the neonatal intensive care unit. The doctors are not telling me anything concrete. They just keep saying they are monitoring the situation. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I prayed the sound of my pulse would not register on the hospital monitors beside my bed. "Take him," he said him. A boy. Every piece of the puzzle that I had ignored for the past 9 months suddenly violently locked into place. The sudden late nights at the office, the unexplained charges on our credit cards that he brushed off as client entertainment, the way he guarded his phone like it contained state secrets, the business partner he had to call the moment my daughter was born. There was no business partner. Every woman has a deep, undeniable intuition. For months, a quiet voice in the back of my mind had been trying to warn me that something was terribly wrong in my marriage. I had silenced that voice with logic. I told myself Jason was just stressed about becoming a father. I told myself that men process pregnancy differently. I convinced myself that I was being hormonal and paranoid. But lying in that hospital bed listening to my husband and his mother collude in the shadows, that intuition roared into a blinding certainty. Jason had another family. He had another woman. And by some sick, twisted twist of fate, that woman was giving birth right here, in this exact same hospital, on the exact same night. The pieces fell together with terrifying speed. Brenda had always been obsessed with having a grandson. She came from an old-fashioned family that believed the family name was the only thing that mattered. When we found out we were having a girl, Jason had been distant, but Brenda had been openly disappointed. She had actually sighed, looked at my growing belly, and said that perhaps I would get it right the next time. Now her frantic question made perfect sense. She did not care about Lily because Lily was just a girl. Lily was the child of the unremarkable accountant he had married. But down the hall, in another wing of this massive hospital, Jason's other woman had just given birth to a boy. A boy that Brenda clearly knew about. A boy that Brenda cared about more than the legitimate granddaughter lying in my arms. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, so intense I thought I might actually be sick. The man I had loved, the man I had built a home with, had spent the last 9 hours ignoring my agony because his mistress was in labor down the hall. Every time he had checked his phone while I was crying through contractions, he was checking on her. Every time he stepped out of the room to pace the hallway, he was likely sneaking down to the other maternity ward to hold her hand. The betrayal was so profound it felt like the walls of the room were closing in on me. They were standing mere feet away from me, discussing the survival of his illegitimate son, completely unbothered by the fact that I was lying right there. They thought I was a fool. They thought I was weak. They thought I was so exhausted and medicated that they could literally conduct their double life right in front of my face. Brenda started crying. It was a soft, pathetic sound. "You have to go back down there," she told him. "You need to be with him. You cannot just stay up here." "I cannot leave right now," Jason hissed back. "If I disappear for another 2 hours, she will wake up and start asking questions. I already told her I was making business calls. I have to play this carefully. Play this carefully." He was managing me like a public relations crisis. I was not his wife. I was a logistical problem he needed to solve so he could get back to his real priority. "You need to fix this," Brenda whispered fiercely. "That is your son, Jason. My grandson. You belong down there." "I will handle it," Jason replied, his voice dripping with irritation. "Just go home, Mom. You being here is only going to make this more complicated. If she wakes up and sees you acting like this, she will know something is wrong. I will text you updates from the intensive care unit as soon as I can find an excuse to leave this room again." I heard the rustle of clothing. I imagined Brenda wiping her tears, straightening her expensive blazer, pulling her mask of upper-class respectability back into place. "I will pray for him," she said softly. "Just go," he replied. The heavy wooden door opened and closed again. The room fell back into a suffocating silence. I kept my eyes squeezed shut. The darkness behind my eyelids was spinning. A hot, stinging tear leaked from the corner of my eye and slid down my temple, soaking into the thin hospital pillow. I could not move. I was terrified that if I opened my eyes, if I looked at him, the sheer force of my hatred would tear me apart. I felt the mattress shift as Jason sat back down in the vinyl chair. The familiar sound of his laptop opening echoed in the quiet room. The clicking of the keyboard resumed. He was probably texting her. He was probably researching premature infant survival rates. He was doing everything in his power to care for his other family, while sitting less than 10 feet away from the daughter he had barely looked at. I lay there for a long time listening to the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. It was the only thing grounding me to reality. In the span of 5 minutes, my entire world had been incinerated. The life I thought I had was a carefully constructed lie funded by my paycheck, maintained by my naive trust, and protected by his mother. I was a placeholder. I was the respectable, boring wife he kept at home, while he built his actual dreams with someone else. But as the initial shock began to recede, it left something else in its wake. If I had been a different kind of woman, I might have sat up right then and there. I might have screamed at him, thrown my water cup at his head, and demanded a divorce. I might have caused a scene that would have brought the nurses running. I might have let my emotions dictate my actions, but I am an accountant. I deal in ledgers, balances, and hard evidence. I know that when you confront an embezzler before you have all the receipts, they will simply destroy the evidence and find a way to make you look crazy. Jason was a master manipulator. He had lied to my face for a year. If I confronted him now, armed with nothing but a conversation I overheard while pretending to sleep, he would deny it. He would call me delusional. He would say the stress of childbirth was making me hallucinate. He would twist the narrative, paint me as unstable, and use it against me in a custody battle. I was not going to give him that advantage. The sadness evaporating from my chest was replaced by a cold, calculating fury. It was a terrifying, crystal-clear anger. They thought I was just a naive, exhausted woman who could be easily deceived. They had underestimated me entirely. I slowly opened my eyes. I blinked a few times, adjusting to the harsh fluorescent light. I let out a soft groan, playing the part of the waking, weary mother perfectly. Jason's head snapped up from his screen. He immediately rearranged his features into a mask of mild concern. He stood up and walked over to the side of the bed. "Hey," he said softly. His voice was smooth, completely devoid of the panic I had just heard moments ago. "You were out for a while. How are you feeling?" I looked up at his handsome face. I saw the dark circles under his eyes, and knew they were not there because he was worried about me. They were there because he was exhausted from running between 2 delivery rooms. I looked at the hands resting on the metal rail of my bed, and realized they had likely just been holding the hands of another woman. I felt a smile stretch across my face. It felt alien and plastic, but it was flawless. "I feel much better," I whispered, keeping my voice weak and raspy. The sleep really helped. He smiled back, a hollow gesture that made my stomach turn. "Good. You need your rest. The doctor said you should stay off your feet for a few days." "Did your mom stop by?" I asked casually. I thought I heard her voice in a dream. Jason did not miss a beat. He chuckled, a short dismissive sound. "Yeah," she popped in for a second. "She wanted to see the baby, but you were both sleeping so peacefully, she did not want to wake you. You know how she gets. She just left a few minutes ago." He lied with such breathtaking ease. There was no hesitation, no guilt in his eyes. He was a sociopath in a tailored suit, and I was looking right at him. "That was sweet of her," I murmured. I shifted my weight, wincing appropriately. "Jason, I am so thirsty, but my water is empty. Do you think you could run down to the cafeteria and get me some apple juice?" He glanced at his phone, his anxiety flaring up again. "The cafeteria is pretty far down on the first floor," he noted, hesitantly. "I can just page the nurse." "Please," I said, making my eyes wide and pleading. "The hospital juice is always warm. The cafeteria has the cold bottles. I would really appreciate it." I watched the internal struggle play out on his face. He wanted to leave the room. He needed an excuse to get back to the intensive care unit to check on his son. My request gave him the perfect alibi. He could disappear for 20 minutes under the guise of being a devoted husband fetching his wife a drink. "Sure," he said quickly, grabbing his wallet from the bedside table. "I will be right back. Just rest." He turned and practically sprinted out the door. The moment the door clicked shut, the performance ended. I pushed myself up in the hospital bed, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my lower abdomen. I placed Lily carefully in the clear plastic bassinet beside the bed, making sure she was secure and comfortable. Then I turned my attention to the vinyl chair in the corner of the room. Jason had been in such a rush to get back to his other family that he had made a fatal mistake. He had taken his wallet, but in his haste he had left his laptop sitting open on the chair. The screen had gone dark to save power, but it was not closed. I threw the hospital blanket off my legs. Every movement was agony, but adrenaline is a powerful painkiller. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My bare feet hit the cold linoleum floor. I gripped the rolling IV pole for support and forced myself to stand. I had exactly 20 minutes before he returned with that apple juice. 20 minutes to find the thread that would unravel his entire hidden life. I took a shaky breath, tightened my grip on the metal pole, and took my first step toward the corner of the room. I was no longer a victim waiting for answers. I was an accountant about to start the most important audit of my life, and I was going to tear his world apart piece by piece. The heavy wooden door of my hospital room swung open with a sudden violence that made me flinch. I had just managed to get my breathing under control. The exhaustion of a 14-hour labor was settling deep into my muscles, pulling me toward a sleep I desperately needed. Lily was a warm, fragile weight against my chest, finally resting after her traumatic entry into the world. But any hope for peace shattered the second my mother-in-law crossed the threshold. Brenda did not knock. She did not enter with the soft reverence people usually reserve for maternity wards. She stormed into the room like a woman running out of time. I had spent the last 3 years trying to earn Brenda's approval. I endured her backhanded compliments about my modest background. I swallowed my pride when she casually mentioned that her son could have married the daughter of a real estate tycoon. I hosted every holiday dinner, baked her favorite desserts, and smiled until my cheeks ached while she critiqued my housekeeping. I did all of it because I believed that family was supposed to stick together. I believed that if I just proved my devotion, she would eventually see me as a daughter. But as Brenda practically ran across the sterile linoleum floor, the truth of our relationship was laid bare. She did not look at the hospital bed. She did not glance at the tiny, swaddled newborn resting in my arms. She completely ignored the fact that her first official grandchild had just been born. Her eyes, wide and frantic, were locked entirely on Jason. I watched her through heavy eyelids. The medication and the exhaustion made the room feel slightly surreal, like I was watching a scene unfold underwater. I saw her reach him. She did not offer a congratulatory hug. She did not shed a tear of joy. Instead, her manicured hands reached out and seized the fabric of his expensive dress shirt. Her knuckles were white. She pulled him close, her face inches from his, and hissed a question that would echo in my mind for the rest of my life. That baby, did he survive? The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air in my lungs turned to ice. My mind scrambled, desperate to make sense of a sentence that belonged in a nightmare, not a maternity ward. That baby. Did he survive? I did not gasp. I did not sit up and demand to know what she was talking about. A primal survival instinct, older and deeper than conscious thought, took over my body. I let my head loll slightly to the side. I allowed my breathing to slow into a deep, rhythmic pattern. I closed my eyes entirely, presenting the perfect picture of an exhausted mother who had finally succumbed to sleep. But beneath my closed eyelids, my brain was firing on all cylinders. I was an accountant. My entire career was built on finding anomalies, tracking discrepancies, and uncovering the truth hidden in complex spreadsheets. Now, I was turning that analytical focus onto my own life. Jason let out a harsh, frustrated breath. He pulled her hands off his shirt and stepped back. His voice was a low, angry rumble, meant only for her ears, but the quiet of the hospital room carried every syllable straight to me. "Keep your voice down," he snapped. "She is sleeping." I heard Brenda let out a shaky breath. "I do not care if she is sleeping," she whispered sharply. "I need to know what is happening down there." He ran a hand over his face. The sound of his palm against his rough stubble was agonizingly loud. "It was bad," he muttered. The premature birth caused massive complications. They had to take him to the neonatal intensive care unit. The doctors are not telling me anything concrete. They just keep saying they are monitoring the situation. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I prayed the sound of my pulse would not register on the hospital monitors beside my bed. "Take him," he said him, a boy. Every piece of the puzzle that I had ignored for the past 9 months suddenly violently locked into place. The sudden late nights at the office, the unexplained charges on our credit cards that he brushed off as client entertainment, the way he guarded his phone like it contained state secrets, the business partner he had to call the moment my daughter was born. There was no business partner. Every woman has a deep, undeniable intuition. For months, a quiet voice in the back of my mind had been trying to warn me that something was terribly wrong in my marriage. I had silenced that voice with logic. I told myself Jason was just stressed about becoming a father. I told myself that men process pregnancy differently. I convinced myself that I was being hormonal and paranoid. But lying in that hospital bed listening to my husband and his mother collude in the shadows, that intuition roared into a blinding certainty. Jason had another family. He had another woman. And by some sick, twisted twist of fate, that woman was giving birth right here in this exact same hospital, on the exact same night. The pieces fell together with terrifying speed. Brenda had always been obsessed with having a grandson. She came from an old-fashioned family that believed the family name was the only thing that mattered. When we found out we were having a girl, Jason had been distant, but Brenda had been openly disappointed. She had actually sighed, looked at my growing belly, and said that perhaps I would get it right the next time. Now her frantic question made perfect sense. She did not care about Lily because Lily was just a girl. Lily was the child of the unremarkable accountant he had married. But down the hall, in another wing of this massive hospital, Jason's other woman had just given birth to a boy. A boy that Brenda clearly knew about. A boy that Brenda cared about more than the legitimate granddaughter lying in my arms. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me so intense, I thought I might actually be sick. The man I had loved, the man I had built a home with, had spent the last 9 hours ignoring my agony because his mistress was in labor down the hall. Every time he had checked his phone while I was crying through contractions, he was checking on her. Every time he stepped out of the room to pace the hallway, he was likely sneaking down to the other maternity ward to hold her hand. The betrayal was so profound it felt like the walls of the room were closing in on me. They were standing mere feet away from me discussing the survival of his illegitimate son, completely unbothered by the fact that I was lying right there. They thought I was a fool. They thought I was weak. They thought I was so exhausted and medicated that they could literally conduct their double life right in front of my face. Brenda started crying. It was a soft, pathetic sound. "You have to go back down there," she told him. "You need to be with him. You cannot just stay up here." "I cannot leave right now," Jason hissed back. If I disappear for another 2 hours, she will wake up and start asking questions. I already told her I was making business calls. I have to play this carefully. Play this carefully. He was managing me like a public relations crisis. I was not his wife. I was a logistical problem he needed to solve so he could get back to his real priority. You need to fix this, Brenda whispered fiercely. That is your son Jason, my grandson. You belong down there. I will handle it, Jason replied, his voice dripping with irritation. Just go home, Mom. You being here is only going to make this more complicated. If she wakes up and sees you acting like this, she will know something is wrong. I will text you updates from the intensive care unit as soon as I can find an excuse to leave this room again. I heard the rustle of clothing. I imagined Brenda wiping her tears, straightening her expensive blazer, pulling her mask of upper-class respectability back into place. I will pray for him, she said softly. Just go, he replied. The heavy wooden door opened and closed again. The room fell back into a suffocating silence. I kept my eyes squeezed shut. The darkness behind my eyelids was spinning. A hot, stinging tear leaked from the corner of my eye and slid down my temple, soaking into the thin hospital pillow. I could not move. I was terrified that if I opened my eyes, if I looked at him, the sheer force of my hatred would tear me apart. I felt the mattress shift as Jason sat back down in the vinyl chair. The familiar sound of his laptop opening echoed in the quiet room. The clicking of the keyboard resumed. He was probably texting her. He was probably researching premature infant survival rates. He was doing everything in his power to care for his other family while sitting less than 10 feet away from the daughter he had barely looked at. I lay there for a long time, listening to the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. It was the only thing grounding me to reality. In the span of 5 minutes, my entire world had been incinerated. The life I thought I had was a carefully constructed lie funded by my paycheck, maintained by my naive trust, and protected by his mother. I was a placeholder. I was the respectable, boring wife he kept at home while he built his actual dreams with someone else. But as the initial shock began to recede, it left something else in its wake. If I had been a different kind of woman, I might have sat up right then and there. I might have screamed at him, thrown my water cup at his head, and demanded a divorce. I might have caused a scene that would have brought the nurses running. I might have let my emotions dictate my actions. But I am an accountant. I deal in ledgers, balances, and hard evidence. I know that when you confront an embezzler before you have all the receipts, they will simply destroy the evidence and find a way to make you look crazy. Jason was a master manipulator. He had lied to my face for a year. If I confronted him now, armed with nothing but a conversation I overheard while pretending to sleep, he would deny it. He would call me delusional. He would say the stress of childbirth was making me hallucinate. He would twist the narrative, paint me as unstable, and use it against me in a custody battle. I was not going to give him that advantage. The sadness evaporating from my chest was replaced by a cold, calculating fury. It was a terrifying, crystal-clear anger. They thought I was just a naive, exhausted woman who could be easily deceived. They had underestimated me entirely. I slowly opened my eyes. I blinked a few times, adjusting to the harsh fluorescent light. I let out a soft groan, playing the part of the waking, weary mother perfectly. Jason's head snapped up from his screen. He immediately rearranged his features into a mask of mild concern. He stood up and walked over to the side of the bed. "Hey," he said softly. His voice was smooth, completely devoid of the panic I had just heard moments ago. "You were out for a while. How are you feeling?" I looked up at his handsome face. I saw the dark circles under his eyes, and knew they were not there because he was worried about me. They were there because he was exhausted from running between 2 delivery rooms. I looked at the hands resting on the metal rail of my bed and realized they had likely just been holding the hands of another woman. I felt a smile stretch across my face. It felt alien and plastic, but it was flawless. "I feel much better," I whispered, keeping my voice weak and raspy. The sleep really helped. He smiled back, a hollow gesture that made my stomach turn. "Good. You need your rest. The doctor said you should stay off your feet for a few days." "Did your mom stop by?" I asked casually. I thought I heard her voice in a dream. Jason did not miss a beat. He chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "Yeah," she popped in for a second. "She wanted to see the baby, but you were both sleeping so peacefully she did not want to wake you. You know how she gets. She just left a few minutes ago." He lied with such breathtaking ease. There was no hesitation. no guilt in his eyes. He was a sociopath in a tailored suit, and I was looking right at him. "That was sweet of her," I murmured. I shifted my weight, wincing appropriately. "Jason, I am so thirsty, but my water is empty. Do you think you could run down to the cafeteria and get me some apple juice?" He glanced at his phone, his anxiety flaring up again. "The cafeteria is pretty far down on the first floor," he noted hesitantly. "I can just page the nurse." "Wait, please," I said, making my eyes wide and pleading. "The hospital juice is always warm. The cafeteria has the cold bottles. I would really appreciate it." I watched the internal struggle play out on his face. He wanted to leave the room. He needed an excuse to get back to the intensive care unit to check on his son. My request gave him the perfect alibi. He could disappear for 20 minutes under the guise of being a devoted husband, fetching his wife a drink. "Sure," he said quickly, grabbing his wallet from the bedside table. "I will be right back. Just rest." He turned and practically sprinted out the door. The moment the door clicked shut, the performance ended. I pushed myself up in the hospital bed, ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my lower abdomen. I placed Lily carefully in the clear plastic bassinet beside the bed, making sure she was secure and comfortable. Then I turned my attention to the vinyl chair in the corner of the room. Jason had been in such a rush to get back to his other family that he had taken his wallet. But in his haste, he had left his laptop sitting open on the chair. The screen had gone dark to save power, but it was not closed. I threw the hospital blanket off my legs. Every movement was agony, but adrenaline is a powerful painkiller. I swung my legs over the side of the bed. My bare feet hit the cold linoleum floor. I gripped the rolling IV pole for support and forced myself to stand. I had exactly 20 minutes before he returned with that apple juice. 20 minutes to find the thread that would unravel his entire hidden life. I took a shaky breath, tightened my grip on the metal pole, and took my first step toward the heavy wooden door. I was no longer a victim waiting for answers. I was an accountant about to start the most important audit of my life. I pushed the door open a fraction of an inch and peeked out into the hallway. The corridor was dim lit only by the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing near the nurse's station at the far end. I saw Jason turning a corner to the left, heading away from the cafeteria, where he was supposed to be getting my juice. I slipped out of my room, pulling the door quietly shut behind me. I followed him, keeping to the shadows, dragging my bruised and battered body across the cold linoleum floor. Each step required monumental effort. My bare feet slapped softly against the tiles. I had to stop twice, leaning heavily on the IV pole, gasping for air, as fresh waves of pain rolled through my pelvis. But I did not turn back. I tracked his path through the maze of the maternity ward, driven by an absolute need to uncover the truth. I turned the same corner Jason had taken, and found myself in a totally different wing of the hospital. The double doors at the end of this hallway were painted bright blue, adorned with large white block letters that read Neonatal Intensive Care Unit. I stayed hidden behind a large concrete pillar near a row of vending machines, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. And there he was. Jason was slumped against the wall, sitting on the dirty hospital floor, with his knees pulled up to his chest and his head buried deeply in his hands. He looked completely devastated. This was the man who had stood like an unfeeling statue during my 14 hours of agonizing labor, looking at his watch, complaining about the inconvenience of my pain. Now he was falling apart. His shoulders shook with silent, heaving sobs. The contrast was a brutal, physical blow to my gut. The heavy double doors to the intensive care unit swung open with a pneumatic hiss. A doctor in dark blue scrubs stepped out, his face drawn and lined with exhaustion. Jason scrambled to his feet instantly, practically lunging at the physician. "How is she?" he demanded, his voice cracking with a raw, desperate emotion. I had never once heard him use for me. The doctor offered a tight, sympathetic smile. "Your son is stable," the doctor said, his voice echoing clearly down the empty hall. "His lungs are underdeveloped due to the premature delivery, but he is a fighter. He is resting safely in the incubator right now, and his vitals are improving." Jason let out a loud, shuddering breath. A literal sob of overwhelming relief tore from his throat, but the doctor held up a hand, his expression turning grave and somber. However, the doctor continued, "Lauren is not doing well." The complications from the premature delivery caused severe internal hemorrhaging. We had to perform an emergency procedure. She is currently in critical condition, and we are doing everything we can to stabilize her blood pressure. I need you to prepare yourself, Jason. The next 24 hours are crucial. Lauren. The name hit me like a runaway freight train. Suddenly, all the subtle comments, all the passive-aggressive comparisons my mother-in-law Brenda used to make at our family Sunday dinners made perfect and sickening sense. Lauren was the daughter of Richard Sterling Jason's most lucrative and wealthy business partner. She was a polished upper-class heiress. Brenda had always adored Lauren. She used to casually mention how Jason and Lauren had dated briefly during their senior year of college, how they made such a striking and powerful couple, how Lauren's family pedigree would have elevated Jason's career to the stratosphere. I had always brushed it off as a mother's harmless, annoying nostalgia for a past that did not happen. I thought Brenda was just being a bitter mother-in-law who thought no one was good enough for her son. But it was not nostalgia. It was not a mother-in-law being difficult. It was an active, ongoing, monstrous betrayal. The elevator at the far end of the hall dinged brightly. The doors slid open and a wealthy older couple rushed out, their faces pale with panic. It was Richard and Evelyn Sterling, Lauren's parents. Jason ran to them immediately. He collapsed into the arms of Lauren's mother, crying openly on her designer shoulder, while her father patted Jason's back, consoling him with quiet, reassuring words. I watched as Jason buried his face in Evelyn Sterling's neck. This was a man who had never once shed a tear in my presence. When my own father passed away 2 years ago, Jason had patted my back awkwardly and told me to focus on the logistics of the funeral. He had claimed he was just not an emotional person. He said he processed grief internally, but seeing him now sobbing openly, clutching the parents of his mistress, as if his own life was ending, I realized he was perfectly capable of deep, profound emotion. He just never felt any of it for me. The years of emotional starvation I had endured were not because he lacked the capacity to love. It was because he was spending all his emotional currency on someone else. Lauren got his tears, his panic, his devotion. I got his empty presence and his cold annoyance. I raised my phone. My hands were perfectly steady now. All the tears, all the weakness, all the exhaustion had completely vanished, replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. I opened my camera app and pressed record. I captured the desperate hugs, the shared tears, the intimate grief of a family I was never truly a part of. I zoomed in to capture the exact expression of grief on his face. I made sure to get the hospital signage in the background anchoring the time and place indisputably. I recorded the audio of Lauren's father promising to fly in the best specialists from Boston. I took photo after photo, recording video clips of the doctor speaking to them, securing the undeniable absolute proof of his double life. This was my insurance policy. This was the weapon I would forge in the fire of their betrayal and use to destroy them when the time was right. I had seen enough. I could not risk being caught standing in the hallway holding my phone like a spy. I turned around and began the agonizing silent trek back to my room. Every step back was exponentially harder than the journey there. My body was shaking violently from the massive physical exertion and the brutal adrenaline crash. I navigated the quiet corridors, the squeaking wheels of my IV pole sounding like a blaring siren in my own ears. The pain in my abdomen was a roaring fire, but I forced myself to move faster, terrified that Jason might suddenly remember his excuse and head to the cafeteria. I finally reached the heavy wooden door of my room and pushed it open. The room was exactly as I had left it. Lily was sleeping peacefully in her clear plastic bassinet, blissfully unaware that her father was a monster. I scrambled back into the hospital bed, pulling the thin, scratchy blanket up to my chin. I shoved my phone deep under my pillow and squeezed my eyes shut just as the door swung open again. It was not Jason returning with cold apple juice. It was Brenda. She marched into the room, the sharp clicking of her expensive heels, announcing her arrival. Her designer handbag was clutched tightly in her manicured hand. She did not even cast a passing glance at the bassinet where her legitimate, beautiful granddaughter was sleeping. But what Brenda did not know was that I had heard her in the hallway right before she walked through my door. As I was getting back into bed, the door had been slightly ajar, and Brenda was on her cell phone, speaking in loud, demanding, aristocratic tones to someone in the hospital administration. "I do not care what it costs," she had barked into the receiver. "Lauren needs the absolute best care available in this entire facility. Put her in the luxury EIP recovery suite the very moment she is stabilized. Put the entire bill on my black card, and do not ask me about the price again." Now standing at the foot of my bed, Brenda's face was a mask of cold, calculating irritation. I kept my breathing steady, opening my eyes slowly and staring at her, with the tired expression of a woman who had just given birth. "You are awake," she stated flatly. It was not a question inquiring about my well-being. It was an observation of an inconvenience. "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice intentionally weak and raspy. Jason went down to the cafeteria to get me some juice. Brenda waved her hand dismissively, clearly annoyed by the mention of her son doing something for me. "Listen to me very closely, Chloe. I have just spoken with the hospital billing department down in the lobby. Hospital stays are incredibly expensive, and your delivery was entirely routine. There is absolutely no reason for you to drain Jason's finances by lingering here in this bed for 3 days like some fragile princess." I stared at her, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of her audacity. Less than 2 minutes ago, I had listened to this woman authorize an open-ended blank check to secure a luxury VIP suite for her son's mistress. Now she was standing over my bed, glaring down at me, demanding that I cut my medical recovery short to save them a few pennies. The doctor explicitly said I need to rest and be monitored for at least 2 days. I managed to say, my voice trembling with a suppressed rage she mistook for weakness. When Brenda told me to leave early, she didn't just suggest it. She stepped closer to the bed looming over me to exert dominance. "You have a perfectly good mattress at home, Chloe," she said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the generic hospital sheets. "There is no need to milk this experience. Jason has important business matters to handle this week, and he cannot be playing nursemaid to a woman who refuses to get back on her feet." The sheer hypocrisy of her words was astounding. Her son was currently playing nursemaid to another woman in the intensive care unit. I just had a baby. I reminded her, keeping my tone intentionally submissive, feeding her ego. "My body needs time to heal." Brenda rolled her eyes, a gesture so juvenile, it betrayed the ugly core of her personality. "Healing is a state of mind," she snapped. "You are taking advantage of his generosity. I will speak to the discharge planner myself if I have to. You will be out of this bed by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. You can rest in your own bed at home. You need to start being financially responsible, Chloe, especially now that there are more mouths to feed." I simply nodded, looking down at my hands. "Okay, Brenda," I whispered. "If you think that is best." She smirked, clearly satisfied that she had bullied me into submission. "I know what is best," she replied sharply. The double meaning of her final sentence was a sickening, deliberate twist of the knife. More mouths to feed. She meant Lauren's newborn son. She meant that my daughter and I were a burden, a drain on the resources that should be funneled directly to Jason's real, chosen family. She looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. She turned on her heel and marched out of the room, leaving a lingering trail of expensive perfume and profound cruelty in her wake. As the door closed, I pulled my phone from under the pillow and scrolled through the gallery. The images were crisp, high-resolution indictments of a man leading a double life. There was Jason hugging Mr. Sterling. There was Jason crying. There was the NICU sign. I immediately uploaded the files to a secure, encrypted cloud server I used for my most confidential accounting clients. I knew that if Jason suspected anything, my physical phone would be the first thing he would try to destroy or confiscate. By sending the files to the cloud, I ensured that no matter what happened in this room, the evidence was permanently out of his reach. I looked at Lily, my beautiful, innocent daughter, who was born into a family built on a foundation of massive lies. I reached out and gently stroked her soft cheek. She stirred slightly, making a tiny, sweet sound that shattered my heart, and instantly rebuilt it with steel. "We are going to be okay," I whispered to her in the silent room. "Mommy is going to take care of everything." I laid back against the pillows, my mind racing with legal strategies, financial audits, and asset tracking. Jason and Brenda thought they were the chess masters moving pawns across a board. They didn't realize they had just handed the rulebook to the opponent. Let the games begin. I stepped over the threshold of our suburban home less than 24 hours after leaving the hospital. The air inside smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile and terrifying corridors of the maternity ward. I carried my beautiful and sleeping daughter in her car seat, my arms trembling with the severe physical strain of my recent delivery. Jason hovered behind me, carrying nothing but his leather briefcase and his carefully constructed mask of the exhausted new father. Brenda had made good on her threat. The hospital discharge planner miraculously spurred into action by a series of aggressive and demanding phone calls from my mother-in-law had pushed my release paperwork through with dizzying speed. I did not fight the early discharge. I wanted to be back in my own territory. I needed immediate access to my own files, my own secure home network, and most importantly, Jason's personal desktop computer. Jason played his part perfectly upon our arrival. He fluffed the decorative pillows on the living room sofa, offered to fetch me a glass of iced water, and loudly complained about how drained he was from the emotional roller coaster of the past 2 days. He said he was going to take a quick hot shower and try to catch a few hours of sleep before the baby needed her next feeding. I smiled at him with a perfectly practiced expression of gratitude. I thanked him for his help and his presence. I watched him walk up the carpeted stairs, listening closely to the heavy and rhythmic thud of his footsteps. He was completely confident that he had successfully managed his dual crisis. He believed I was securely tucked away downstairs, incapacitated by physical pain, and overwhelmed by maternal hormones, entirely blind to the parallel life he was running, just a few miles away, in the neonatal intensive care unit. I waited in the dim light of the living room. I listened to the sound of the running shower plumbing through the walls, followed by the opening and closing of heavy wooden dresser drawers, and finally the distinctive creak of the master bedroom door shutting firmly. I waited another full hour just to be absolutely certain he was unconscious. The house settled into a deep and oppressive silence, broken only by the soft and rhythmic breathing of my newborn daughter in her portable bassinet beside me. I did not cry. The tears had completely dried up back in that hospital bed. The naive woman who had wept for her husband's affection was gone forever. In her place sat a certified public accountant with a decade of professional experience tracking hidden assets, untangling corporate fraud, and exposing financial discrepancies. I pushed myself up from the sofa. Every movement sent a fiery spike of physical agony through my healing body, but I ignored the pain completely. I walked slowly and deliberately down the dark hallway to the study Jason used as his primary home office. The room was shadowed lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through the horizontal window blinds. His expensive desktop computer sat on the mahogany desk, like a secure vault waiting to be cracked. Jason had always been fiercely protective of his electronic devices, constantly citing strict corporate security policies from his firm. He changed his passwords regularly and never saved his login credentials on shared browsers. But he was also a creature of extreme habit. He thought he was brilliant and untouchable, but his arrogance made him painfully predictable. I knew his psychological patterns. I knew the specific combinations of anniversary dates, favorite collegiate sports teams, and random numeric sequences he cycled through year after year. It took me exactly 3 attempts to breach the primary lock screen. The large monitor flared to life, casting a harsh and revealing blue glow across my face in the dark room. I started my forensic audit with the most obvious and vulnerable target, which was our primary joint savings account. For 5 long years, we had diligently deposited a significant portion of our monthly incomes into this specific account. We referred to it as our foundational future fund. It was explicitly meant for medical emergencies, for our future child's education, and for the ultimate security of the family we were building together. I had personally tracked the balance with meticulous care until I went on mandatory maternity leave just 3 weeks ago. It had sat comfortably at over $120,000. I navigated to our primary banking portal, easily bypassing his 2-factor authentication, because his secondary mobile phone was conveniently charging on the desk right beside the keyboard. He had left it behind, assuming he was entirely safe and beyond suspicion in his own home. I opened the account summary dashboard. The balance staring back at me was exactly $412. I blinked repeatedly, leaning closer to the glowing screen, logically assuming the banking webpage had simply failed to load the data properly. I hit the refresh command. The number remained exactly the same. $412.16. My chest tightened until it was difficult to draw breath. Over $120,000 was simply gone, evaporated into the digital ether. I clicked aggressively into the detailed transaction history, my eyes scanning the long rows of financial data with mechanical and ruthless precision. The massive withdrawals had not happened all at once in a single suspicious lump sum. They had been executed in a series of calculated and substantial wire transfers over the past 8 months. The timeline aligned flawlessly with the exact duration of his wealthy mistress's pregnancy. I immediately traced the routing numbers attached to the outgoing wires. The funds had not been moved into his personal checking account or tied to any legitimate, recognizable investment portfolio. They had been funneled directly into a domestic corporate banking account registered to a newly formed limited liability company. I pulled up the state business registry database and cross-referenced the entity identification numbers. The legal name of the receiving corporation was L&J Future LLC, L and J Lauren and Jason. The sheer and blinding arrogance of the corporate naming convention made my breath hitch in my throat. He had not just stolen my hard-earned money. He had used the exact financial contributions of my physical labor, the money I had exhausted myself earning by working 60-hour weeks during grueling tax seasons, to fund a literal corporate entity dedicated entirely to his future with the daughter of a wealthy tycoon. I did not stop there. The missing savings were a massive and devastating blow, but my professional accounting instincts screamed that this blatant theft was only the surface level of his financial crimes. If he was bold enough to drain a primary joint account right under my nose, he was actively hiding something much larger and far more dangerous. I began searching through his local hard drive files, diving deep into hidden folders and encrypted document stashes. I pulled up PDF files deliberately labeled with generic and boring project names to avoid detection. I cross-referenced email chains he had carelessly left unarchived in his deleted items folder. And then I found the digital master folder simply titled Property Acquisition. My hands began to shake violently as I opened the first scanned document in the folder. It was a massive commercial loan application. The tiny black numbers on the screen blurred for a moment before snapping into terrifying and crystal-clear focus. It was a secondary mortgage agreement, but it was not a document for our current suburban home. The specific address listed on the formal legal documents belonged to a beautiful property in a quiet and upscale neighborhood across town. It was the exact address of the home I had inherited from my late father 3 years ago. The betrayal deepened into a sickening abyss. My father had worked his entire adult life sacrificing his own comforts to fully pay off that house. It was a modest but beautifully maintained property, and he had left it to me free and clear, explicitly stating, in his last will and testament, that the home should serve as an unbreakable safety net for my future children. I had fiercely protected that asset. I had kept the property completely in my name, alone, renting it out to a lovely older couple using the modest monthly income to help cover our daily household expenses. Jason had absolutely zero legal claim to that house. But as I scrolled through the dozens of scanned legal pages, the unfathomable depth of his criminality became horrifyingly clear. He had maliciously used my personal identification documents. He had accessed my social security number, my previous tax returns, and my certified birth certificate. He had systematically forged my signature on multiple notarized documents, effectively taking out a massive and extremely high-interest equity loan against the total appraised value of my late father's house. The approved loan amount was absolutely staggering. He had illegally extracted nearly $300,000 in cash against my inherited property. He had heavily encumbered the only meaningful thing my father had left me to protect my daughter. And he had done it all while looking me directly in the eye, every single evening kissing my forehead and asking what I wanted for dinner. I sat frozen in the chair trying to connect the sprawling financial dots. Why would a man who made a very comfortable 6-figure corporate salary need to actively steal over $400,000 in raw cash? The devastating answer was waiting for me in his archived private email folders. I found the desperate correspondence with elite real estate agents, luxury interior designers, and private medical billing concierges. Lauren, his wealthy mistress, was accustomed to a very specific and lavish standard of living. Her father, the formidable and demanding Richard Sterling, fully expected any man who claimed his daughter to immediately provide a lifestyle commensurate with their esteemed family name. Jason was desperate to prove he was a worthy and capable match for the Sterling heiress. He had to produce massive amounts of liquid capital immediately to maintain the illusion of his own immense wealth. The stolen funds from our joint savings account and the fraudulent loan cash from my father's house were deliberately combined into a single and massive down payment. The digital records showed that they had recently purchased a sprawling and multi-million-dollar mansion in the absolute most exclusive zip code in the entire city. The property deed was officially filed under the L&J Future corporate entity, a brilliant move completely shielding the massive physical asset from my view while utilizing my stolen money to secure it. Furthermore, the emails revealed that Lauren's pregnancy had been considered extremely high risk from the very beginning. The medical bills attached to the correspondence showed exorbitant out-of-pocket expenses for private elite fertility specialists, exclusive concierge, maternity doctors, and now the staggering and astronomical costs of a catastrophic premature delivery and an extended stay in the neonatal intensive care unit. Brenda's arrogant promise to pay for the luxury VIP recovery room was just the very tip of the financial iceberg. Jason was personally funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars into Lauren's ongoing medical care and their future grand estate, entirely financed by the absolute theft of my life savings and the destruction of my father's legacy. I sat back in the heavy leather desk chair. The glowing computer screen illuminated the absolute wreckage of my life. This was not a simple emotional affair. This was not a fleeting moment of weakness or a temporary lapse in marital judgment. This was a deliberate, highly sophisticated, and ruthlessly orchestrated financial crime. He had actively planned to leave me. That much was glaringly obvious from the timelines. He was systematically draining every available resource I possessed, preparing to permanently abandon me and Lily the very moment his new mansion was fully decorated and his new son was safely discharged from the hospital. He had timed the financial theft perfectly, betting everything that I would be far too consumed by the exhausting demands of a new baby to notice the missing funds until it was far too late to recover them. He fully intended to leave me completely destitute, saddled with massive unpayable debt, on a home I thought I owned, free and clear, while he rode off into a sunset of stolen luxury. I looked away from the monitor and out the dark window. The suburban street was quiet and peaceful, completely oblivious to the absolute monster sleeping comfortably in the master bedroom directly above me. He thought he had completely outsmarted me. He thought because I was quiet, because I was agreeable, because I always accommodated his demanding schedule that I was a stupid and compliant victim. But he had made a fatal and catastrophic miscalculation. He had chosen to steal from a woman who spent her entire life analyzing ledgers and tracking hidden money. I did not confront him. I did not storm up the carpeted stairs, throw open the bedroom door, and wake him up with hysterical screams and tearful accusations. That is exactly what a victim does. A victim reacts impulsively to the immediate pain. A survivor silently gathers devastating ammunition. I spent the next 4 continuous hours sitting at that desk methodically and quietly downloading every single digital file, every forged signature document, every incriminating email thread, and every wire transfer receipt. I copied the massive mountain of data onto a highly encrypted external hard drive I kept hidden in my work bag. I also took dozens of clear photographs of the computer screen with my phone to ensure complete backup redundancy. I compiled a mountain of irrefutable and devastating evidence that would not just guarantee me a highly favorable and punitive divorce settlement, but would secure him a very long and miserable stay in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, identity theft, and severe mortgage fraud. When the sun finally began to peek over the distant horizon, painting the morning sky in pale shades of dawn light, I carefully closed all the open browser windows. I shut down the desktop computer, making absolutely certain that every digital shortcut and physical item on the desk was placed exactly as I had originally found it. I wiped down the keyboard and the mouse to remove any trace of my presence. I walked slowly back into the living room, my physical body screaming in profound pain, but my mind operating with a terrifying and razor-sharp focus. I gently picked up my sleeping daughter from her bassinet and held her warmly against my chest. They had deliberately tried to ruin us. They had actively plotted to steal our secure future, to cast us aside into poverty, so they could build their twisted fantasy life using my stolen money. But they were about to discover exactly what happens when you corner a fiercely protective mother who has absolutely nothing left to lose. I was going to let him continue to play his little deceptive game. I was going to smile sweetly, nod agreeably, and play the role of the exhausted and oblivious wife flawlessly. I would let him firmly believe he had won right up until the exact moment I unleashed a legal and financial inferno that would burn his entire stolen world completely to the ground. He desperately wanted to build a lavish future with Lauren using my money. I was going to ensure that the only future he ever experienced involved concrete walls and iron bars. The walls of my own home began to feel like the perimeter of a beautifully decorated prison cell. For the first 2 weeks after I returned from the hospital, I played my assigned role with absolute perfection. I was the exhausted, overwhelmed new mother. I wore loose sweatpants, kept my hair tied in messy knots, and allowed my shoulders to slump with manufactured fatigue. Every time Jason walked into the room, I made sure he saw exactly what he wanted to see. I presented a woman too consumed by the physical demands of a newborn to notice that her husband was systematically dismantling her life. But Jason and his mother Brenda were not content with merely stealing my financial future. Theft apparently was not enough for them. They needed my absolute destruction. It started with subtle, insidious actions designed to make me question my own mind. Jason would intentionally move my keys from the kitchen counter to the dining room table, and when I asked if he had seen them, he would look at me with a sickening display of exaggerated pity. He would sigh deeply, place a heavy hand on my shoulder, and tell me that my memory was getting noticeably worse. He started telling Brenda right in front of me that I was forgetting to feed the baby, which was an absolute and malicious lie. I was meticulously tracking every single ounce Lily consumed in a hidden notebook. I knew exactly what they were doing. It is a classic psychological warfare tactic designed to make the victim doubt their own basic sanity. They were gaslighting me aggressively, laying the groundwork for a narrative that painted me as an unstable and dangerous mother. Brenda became a permanent fixture in our house. She practically moved in citing her deep concern for her son, who was allegedly bearing the terrible burden of a mentally fragile wife. She would walk into the nursery while I was peacefully rocking Lily to sleep, snatch the baby directly from my arms, and loudly declare that I was holding her incorrectly and cutting off her air supply. If Lily cried for even a moment, Brenda would rush down the hallway, her face twisted in theatrical panic, demanding to know what I had done to hurt the child. She would whisper loudly to Jason that I had a vacant, dangerous look in my eyes. I swallowed the white-hot rage that burned in my throat. I let my hands drop to my lap and looked at the floor, offering them the submissive silence they craved. Every time I apologized for my alleged forgetfulness, every time I let Brenda undermine my motherhood without a fight, I was buying myself crucial time. I knew that the more confident they felt in their manipulation, the sloppier they would become with their true agenda. Their psychological campaign escalated rapidly on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was in the living room folding tiny baby clothes when the front door opened. Brenda walked in, shaking the rain from her designer umbrella, followed closely by a tall, silver-haired man wearing a tweed jacket. Jason emerged from his study, immediately greeting the man with a firm handshake and a familiar, practiced smile. Brenda ushered the man into the living room and introduced him as Dr. Arthur Vance. She claimed he was an old dear friend of the family who happened to be in the neighborhood and wanted to drop by to see the new baby. But my professional instincts instantly registered the sharp, evaluating way his eyes scanned my posture, my clothing, and my facial expressions. This was no casual neighborhood visit. The man was a clinical psychologist. I knew his name because Brenda had once bragged about him years ago, boasting about his elite private practice that catered to wealthy families involved in high-stakes custody battles. They sat around my coffee table sipping the tea I had brewed, constructing an elaborate and terrifying trap right in my own living room. Jason sat next to me on the sofa, wrapping his arm tightly around my shoulders. To an outside observer, it would look like a protective and loving gesture. To me, it felt like a heavy iron chain meant to keep me restrained, Dr. Vance leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He laced his fingers together and spoke to me in a soft, condescending tone that made my skin crawl. He asked how I was adjusting to motherhood. He asked if I was feeling overwhelmed, if I ever had dark and intrusive thoughts, if I found myself completely unable to bond with my daughter. He phrased his questions like statements of fact designed to corner me into agreeing with his terrible assumptions. Before I could even formulate a measured response, Jason answered for me. He tightened his grip on my shoulder and told Dr. Vance that I was struggling profoundly. He claimed I was crying for hours in the dark without reason. He fabricated a horrifying story about finding me staring blankly out the window while Lily screamed unattended in her crib. Brenda chimed in, immediately dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue. She told the doctor that she feared every single day for her grandchild's physical safety. She said I was completely detached from reality, prone to sudden aggressive outbursts, and entirely incapable of basic maternal care. I sat perfectly still, listening to them build a fictitious medical history that could permanently strip me of my rights. My heart pounded a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained an unreadable mask. If I defended myself, if I raised my voice and called them the liars they were, Dr. Vance would simply document my emotional reaction as definitive proof of my aggressive tendencies and mental instability. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to scream so they could point at me and call me crazy. Instead, I slumped my shoulders even further. I let a single, calculated tear slip down my cheek. I looked at Dr. Vance with wide, exhausted eyes and whispered that I was just so very tired. I told him that my husband and my mother-in-law were completely right, that I was failing to keep up with the physical and mental demands of recovery. I played the broken, defeated woman flawlessly. Dr. Vance nodded solemnly, pulling a small, leather-bound notebook from his breast pocket. I watched his silver pen move across the page, knowing exactly what he was diagnosing me with. Severe postpartum psychosis. A definitive danger to myself and my newborn child. The sheer evil of their plan was breathtaking. Jason was not just leaving me for Lauren. He was actively planning to take my daughter away from me forever. The moment they finally left the house, taking their toxic whispers out into the rain, I felt a surge of adrenaline that cleared the fog of exhaustion completely. Jason went straight to his study and closed the door, undoubtedly calling Lauren to report that the primary obstacle in their grand plan was successfully being neutralized. I needed absolute physical confirmation of what Dr. Vance was meant to accomplish. That night, after Jason had taken his sleeping pills and fallen into a heavy snoring slumber, I slipped out of bed. I crept down the hallway, the floorboards cold beneath my bare feet. I bypassed his computer entirely this time. Jason had been carrying a thick manila folder when he returned from a meeting the previous day, and he had locked it securely inside the bottom drawer of his heavy metal filing cabinet. I had found the spare key to that exact cabinet months ago, long before I ever suspected his betrayal, simply by organizing his office supplies. I retrieved the small silver key from its hiding place inside a hollowed-out dictionary on the bottom bookshelf. I slid it into the lock, turning it with excruciating slowness, to avoid making a single metallic sound. The drawer slid open smoothly. I pulled out the manila folder and carried it to the small desk lamp, turning the light to its absolute lowest setting. The thick stack of legal documents inside bore the embossed letterhead of a highly aggressive, incredibly expensive family law firm located in downtown Seattle. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs of legal jargon translating the cold print into the horrific reality of his intentions. It was a fully drafted petition for emergency, full legal and physical custody, accompanied by a formal motion for involuntary psychiatric commitment. The documents outlined a devastating, entirely fabricated narrative designed to destroy a judge's faith in me. They cited sworn testimony from Jason, corroborating statements from Brenda, and an official preliminary medical evaluation signed by Dr. Arthur Vance. The petition explicitly claimed that I was suffering from severe postpartum depression that had rapidly escalated into violent and unpredictable psychosis. It stated that I was a direct, immediate, and lethal threat to my newborn daughter, but the custody petition was only the first half of the trap. The second half was a financial death warrant designed to bury me permanently. Attached to the custody papers was a draft for a highly contested divorce settlement. because the legal narrative they were building painted me as completely incapacitated and mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. Jason was petitioning the family court for full emergency conservatorship over all marital assets. He was explicitly requesting that my inherited home, the property he had already secretly mortgaged to the hilt to buy his new mansion with Lauren, be entirely liquidated under his sole supervision. The paperwork claimed he needed to sell my family home to supposedly pay for my long-term mandatory psychiatric care in a locked facility. I read the words again and again, letting the sheer, unadulterated magnitude of their cruelty wash over me. This was never just about moving on with another wealthy woman. Jason and Brenda wanted to erase me from society entirely. If they succeeded with this petition, I would be dragged from my home by the police, locked away in a psychiatric ward, stripped of all my maternal rights, and left completely destitute. Lily would be handed over to Jason and Lauren without a fight. Brenda would finally have her wealthy, upper-class daughter-in-law, and my beautiful baby girl would be raised by the very monsters who destroyed her mother. They would live comfortably in their multi-million-dollar estate, funded by my stolen life savings and the illegal theft of my father's legacy, while I rotted in a sterile hospital room, deemed legally crazy and unable to defend myself. I carefully took high-resolution photographs of every single page using my cell phone, making absolutely sure the lighting was clear enough to capture every malicious lie and forged date they had typed. I synced the images directly to my hidden encrypted cloud server, adding them to the massive mountain of financial evidence I had already gathered during my previous audit. I placed the documents back into the folder in the exact order I had found them. I locked the filing cabinet, wiped the metal handle with the hem of my shirt to remove any fingerprints, and returned the silver key to the hollowed-out book on the shelf. I walked back upstairs to the nursery. The room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of a small nightlight. Lily was sleeping soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful, steady rhythm. I stood over her crib for a very long time. I reached out and gently rested my hand against her warm back, feeling the fragile life that I had brought into this world. They thought they were dealing with a weak, easily manipulated woman who would simply shatter under the heavy weight of their psychological warfare. They firmly believed that their vast wealth, their elite connections, and their carefully orchestrated lies would effortlessly crush me into silent dust. They had evaluated me falsely, diagnosed me, and written the tragic ending to my story without ever realizing who they were truly dealing with. I was not going to break. I was going to turn their entire conspiracy inside out. I knew that if I panicked and tried to run away with Lily now, Jason would immediately file the emergency petition with the court. He would use my sudden flight as undeniable concrete proof of my alleged manic paranoia and instability. The police would hunt me down, tear my screaming daughter from my arms, and hand her directly to the man sleeping in the next room. I could not run. I had to stay right here, anchored in the very center of the storm. I had to beat them at their own incredibly dangerous legal game. I needed to let them confidently file their fraudulent paperwork with the court. I needed them to stand up in front of a family court judge and swear under the absolute penalty of perjury that their fabricated lies were the absolute truth. I would let them build their arrogant, towering house of cards as high as they possibly could. And then when the entire world was watching, and they felt completely victorious, I would pull the foundational pin and watch their lives collapse into inescapable, catastrophic ruin. The profound grief and the paralyzing shock were entirely gone now. My tears had dried up completely, leaving behind a barren landscape. What remained in my soul was a cold, impenetrable armor of pure determination. I walked back to the master bedroom and slid silently under the covers next to the man who was actively trying to destroy my entire existence. I listened to his heavy, arrogant breathing, matching my own breath to his rhythm, hiding perfectly in the dark. Tomorrow, I would wake up and smile at him. I would brew his morning coffee. I would listen to Brenda insult my parenting without saying a word. I would play the perfect, pathetic, broken victim they needed me to be. And behind that compliant mask, I would finalize the legal and financial counterattack that would guarantee Jason lost absolutely everything he valued. I would ensure that Brenda watched her precious son be dragged away in federal handcuffs. The ultimate battle for my motherhood, my sanity, and my life had officially begun, and I was going to be the only one left standing when the dust finally settled. The morning air in our home was thick and suffocating, much like the heavy Seattle fog that pressed against the living room windows. 3 days had passed since Dr. Vance sat on my sofa and casually diagnosed me with a severe psychological condition I did not have. For those 3 days, I moved through the rooms of my own house like a ghost haunting its own life. I shuffled from the nursery to the kitchen in oversized sweatpants, keeping my gaze lowered, my voice barely above a whisper. I fed my beautiful daughter, bathed her, and rocked her to sleep while maintaining the perfect facade of a woman crumbling under the weight of her own mind. Jason and Brenda watched me with barely concealed satisfaction. They believed their campaign of psychological terror was working flawlessly. They thought they had successfully shattered my spirit and reduced me to a compliant, fragile shell of a human being. They had no idea that beneath my slumped shoulders and tear-stained cheeks, my mind was operating with the cold, lethal precision of a steel trap. The true test of my performance arrived on a gloomy Thursday afternoon. Brenda had finally left the house to attend a luncheon with her wealthy friends, leaving Jason and me entirely alone for the first time all week. Lily was asleep in her crib upstairs, the baby monitor softly broadcasting the rhythmic sound of her tiny breaths. I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly into a mug of lukewarm chamomile tea, playing my part to absolute perfection. I heard the heavy, purposeful footsteps of my husband coming down the hallway from his study. He walked into the kitchen carrying a thick stack of formal-looking envelopes and a manila folder. His face was arranged in a tight mask of manufactured stress and deep, terrible burden. He sighed loudly, dropping the massive stack of papers directly onto the wooden table in front of me, with a heavy thud that made the ceramic mug rattle. I slowly lifted my head and looked at him with wide, exhausted eyes. I asked him what all those papers were, forcing my voice to tremble slightly. Jason pulled out the chair across from me and sat down heavily. He ran his hands through his hair, gripping the roots as if he were trying to keep his head from exploding. He looked at me with a sickening display of pity and profound disappointment. He told me that these were the final hospital bills for my delivery and my extended stay in the maternity ward. He let out another harsh breath and claimed that our primary health insurance provider had completely denied the majority of the coverage. He spun a highly detailed and incredibly complex lie about bureaucratic red tape out of network billing codes and policy loopholes. He said the insurance company determined my hospital stay was unnecessarily prolonged and therefore medically unjustifiable. He stated that we were suddenly on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars in immediate out-of-pocket medical expenses. I stared at the stack of envelopes. I knew exactly what a legitimate hospital bill looked like. I also knew, because I handled all of our household finances before my maternity leave, that our insurance policy was premium tier and covered maternity care comprehensively. There was no denial of coverage. The bills sitting on the table were nothing more than a fabricated crisis. Jason had likely printed out generic billing statements and stuffed them into windowed envelopes to create a visual mountain of overwhelming debt. He needed me to feel panicked. He needed me to feel entirely responsible for a massive financial catastrophe so he could present his ultimate malicious solution. I let my lower lip quiver. I raised my hands to my face and let a few hot tears spill over my eyelashes. I told him I was so sorry. I told him I did not understand how this could happen. I played right into his hands, acting completely terrified of the financial ruin he was describing. He reached across this table and covered my trembling hands with his own. His skin felt cold and entirely devoid of affection. He told me to calm down and breathe. He used that smooth, condescending tone he always adopted when he wanted to sound like the benevolent provider shielding his weak wife from the harsh realities of the world. He said he had been up all night trying to figure out a solution to resolve his financial difficulties. He claimed that between the sudden hospital debt, the regular household expenses, and the rising costs of caring for a newborn, his liquid cash was completely depleted. He said his credit was currently tied up in corporate investments for his firm, making it impossible for him to secure a standard personal loan from our bank. And then, with the casual precision of a predator sinking its teeth into a snare, he slid the thick manila folder across the table toward me. He tapped his index finger against the cardboard cover. He told me there was only one viable option left to save our family from immediate bankruptcy. He said he needed to secure a fast, short-term equity bridge loan using my inherited property as collateral. He framed the request with breathtaking manipulation. He reminded me that the house my late father left me was sitting completely empty of debt. He said it was just sitting there doing nothing while our family was drowning in unpaid medical bills. He claimed he only needed to borrow against it for 6 months, just until his annual corporate bonuses cleared, and then he would pay the entire loan back and clear the title. He looked deeply into my eyes and told me he hated asking me to do this, but he was desperate to keep a roof over our heads and protect our daughter. I looked down at the manila folder. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my mind was perfectly still. I knew exactly what was inside that folder because I had seen the digital drafts hidden on his computer just a few nights ago. He was not trying to secure a simple temporary equity loan to pay imaginary hospital bills. He had already fraudulently mortgaged my property using my stolen identity to fund his new luxury mansion with Lauren. The documents sitting on my kitchen table were the final nail in the coffin. He needed my actual physical signature to completely transfer the legal ownership of my father's house into the limited liability company he had created with his mistress. I slowly opened the folder. The top document was an aggressively dense legal contract filled with complex real estate terminology, liability clauses, and binding arbitration agreements. To an exhausted, medically diagnosed, and overwhelmed woman, it would look like an impenetrable wall of terrifying legal jargon. To a certified public accountant with a decade of corporate financial experience, it read like a brightly lit roadmap of monumental fraud. Jason pointed to a specific paragraph near the bottom of the second page. He told me it was just a standard power of attorney authorization. He claimed it simply gave him the legal right to negotiate the terms of the loan with the bank on my behalf, so I would not have to leave the house and deal with the stress of lawyers and loan officers. He said he wanted to take the entire burden off my shoulders, so I could focus entirely on my mental health and caring for Lily. I let my eyes scan the tiny black text. My professional training automatically highlighted every single malicious trap buried in the document. It was not a power of attorney. It was an irrevocable quitclaim deed. Section 4, paragraph 2 explicitly stated that I, the grantor, was permanently, fully, and unconditionally surrendering all legal rights, titles, interests, and equity in the property to the designated grantee, and there printed clearly in subsection B was the name of the grantee, L&J Future, LLC. He was sitting across the table from me, holding my hand, pretending to be my savior, while actively trying to steal the only remaining asset my father had ever given me. The sheer, unadulterated evil of his plan was almost impossible to comprehend. He wanted to strip me of my inheritance funnel, the entire value of my family home, directly to his mistress, and leave me completely destitute before serving me with divorce papers and a psychiatric custody petition. I felt a sudden, dangerous surge of pure rage rising in my chest. I wanted to pick up the ceramic mug and hurl the lukewarm tea directly into his lying, arrogant face. I wanted to scream at him that I knew about Lauren. I knew about the intensive care unit, and I knew about the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had stolen from our joint savings. I wanted to rip the fraudulent documents to shreds and tell him I would see him rot in a federal prison cell. But I forced the rage down into the deepest, coldest part of my stomach. I remembered the custody petition locked in his filing cabinet. I remembered Dr. Vance sitting on my sofa writing down his false diagnosis. If I reacted with anger now, if I refused to sign the documents and exposed my knowledge, Jason would immediately panic. He would realize his cover was blown. He would initiate the emergency psychiatric hold before I had the chance to secure a bulletproof legal defense. I had to let him believe he had completely outsmarted me. I had to give him exactly what he wanted, but in a way that rendered it entirely and legally useless. I let out a loud, shuddering sob. I pulled my hands away from him and buried my face in my palms, allowing my shoulders to shake violently. I hyperventilated, slightly mimicking the exact symptoms of a severe panic attack. I cried out that I was so scared. I told him I did not understand any of the legal terms on the paper, and that the thought of losing my father's house was too much to bear. I played the hysterical, irrational woman perfectly. Jason sighed heavily, the sound thick with manufactured patience. He stood up, walked around the table, and wrapped his arms around my shaking shoulders. He kissed the top of my head and murmured soothing, empty promises into my hair. He promised me that he would never let anything happen to my father's legacy. He swore on his life that this was only a temporary measure to save our family from ruin. He gently pushed a black ink pen into my trembling right hand. He pointed to the thick yellow sticker indicating the signature line on the final page of the quitclaim deed. He told me to just sign my name and let him handle all the terrible stress. I kept my head bowed, my hair falling forward to shield my eyes. I gripped the pen tightly. I knew that in order to legally transfer a property deed, the document required a notarized signature. I also knew Jason had a close college friend who worked as a certified notary public, a man whose moral compass was just as flexible and corrupt as Jason's. I had no doubt his friend would illegally stamp the document later, without ever witnessing my signature in person. But a forged notary stamp could not validate a completely fraudulent signature. I took a deep, ragged breath and pressed the tip of the pen to the heavy paper. I am naturally right-handed. My legal signature is a swift, sharp, and highly consistent cursive loop that I have used on every single tax return, bank document, and legal contract I have ever signed in my entire adult life. It is deeply ingrained in my muscle memory. I deliberately shifted my grip on the pen, holding it awkwardly between my middle and ring fingers. I forced my hand to tremble violently as I dragged the ink across the page. I did not write my swift, elegant cursive. I intentionally printed the letters of my first name with jerky, completely uncoordinated strokes that slanted heavily to the left. When I reached my last name, I made a crucial, deliberate error. I intentionally misspelled it, swapping the placement of two vowels in a way that looked like the tragic mistake of a heavily medicated, completely disoriented woman. I ended the signature with a sloppy, jagged line that trailed off the bottom of the designated box. The signature on that page did not belong to me. It did not match my driver's license. It did not match our marriage certificate. It did not match a single, verified financial document on record. Any basic forensic handwriting analysis would instantly and conclusively prove that the signature was a catastrophic anomaly. Furthermore, the deliberate misspelling of my own legal name rendered the contract entirely invalid and utterly useless in any legitimate court of law or county recording office. I dropped the pen onto the table as if it had burned my fingers. I covered my face again and began to weep loudly, apologizing repeatedly for being such a burden and a terrible wife. I cried that I missed my father and that I felt like I was failing everyone. Jason did not notice the jagged, misspelled nightmare of a signature. He was too consumed by his own arrogance and his desperate eagerness to finalize his theft. He quickly gathered the scattered pages, tapping them neatly against the wooden table. He slid the documents back into the thick manila folder and tucked it securely under his arm. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with the triumphant, sickening light of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen a small fortune from a helpless victim. He patted my shoulder one last time. He told me I had done the right thing and that he was incredibly proud of me for being so brave. He said he was going to take the documents straight to his office to file them with his loan officer immediately so we could finally put this terrible financial nightmare behind us. He told me to go upstairs, take my medication, and get some sleep. I kept my face buried in my hands, nodding silently until I heard his footsteps recede down the hallway. I listened to the sound of the front door opening and closing. I heard the electronic chirp of his car unlocking in the driveway, followed by the low hum of the engine starting and fading away down the wet suburban street. The moment the sound of his car completely disappeared, the performance ended. I lowered my hands from my face. My tears evaporated instantly. I reached for a napkin and calmly wiped the residual moisture from my cheeks. The house was entirely silent, safe, and secure. I stood up from the kitchen table. My physical pain was still a constant heavy ache, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in months. Jason was currently speeding toward downtown Seattle, completely convinced that he was holding the golden ticket to his new life with Lauren. He was going to hand that fraudulently notarized, blatantly misspelled document to a county clerk. He was going to tie his illegal corporation to a profoundly flawed and deeply compromised legal contract. He thought he was systematically dismantling my life, but he had just handed me the final, irrefutable piece of evidence I needed to lock him in a federal prison. I had survived his physical absence. I had survived his mother's emotional cruelty. I had survived the terrifying revelation of his secret life. And now I had successfully sabotaged his financial escape route. The trap was fully set, the evidence was perfectly secured. and the timer on his destruction had officially begun to tick. The meeting with the attorney took place on a cold and gray Thursday morning. Her name was Evelyn Carter. She was not a standard family court lawyer who handled basic divorce paperwork and simple child support calculations. She was a former federal prosecutor who had built a formidable private practice specializing strictly in high-asset family financial fraud and complex corporate embezzlement. Her office was located on the 40th floor of a downtown skyscraper. It was an intimidating, deeply quiet space, lined entirely with thick legal volumes and framed credentials. I sat across the polished mahogany table and meticulously laid out my digital evidence. I showed her the forged quitclaim deed with my deliberately misspelled signature. I showed her the comprehensive transaction logs detailing the massive draining of our joint savings account. I presented the official state corporate registration for the limited liability company Jason had formed with his mistress. Evelyn reviewed the files with the detached analytical precision of a seasoned surgeon examining an X-ray. She did not offer empty sympathy or false platitudes. She simply told me I had done an extraordinary job protecting my assets and documenting his financial crimes. However, she leaned forward and explained a very gauche and unyielding legal reality. Digital copies and electronic trails were an excellent starting point, but highly paid defense attorneys could easily argue that electronic records had been digitally altered, hacked, or taken completely out of context. To ensure Jason and Brenda faced actual federal prison time for wire fraud, identity theft, and grand conspiracy, instead of receiving a simple slap on the wrist in a forgiving family court, we needed foundational documents. We needed the physical contracts. We needed the original unmodified pages containing their original wet ink signatures. We needed the master plan that proved their ultimate criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt. I looked her directly in the eye. I knew exactly where those documents were hidden. Brenda lived in a sprawling, ostentatious, and heavily gated estate on Mercer Island. She frequently boasted to anyone who would listen about her massive custom-built floor safe. She claimed it was entirely fireproof, mathematically impenetrable, and completely secure. She kept it hidden in her private home office, a room that was strictly off-limits to everyone except Jason. But Brenda was a woman blinded by her own massive, suffocating arrogance. She firmly believed that nobody in her social orbit possessed the intelligence or the courage to challenge her supreme authority. Every single Sunday attendance at her lavish family dinner was absolutely mandatory. She demanded our presence so she could parade us around her wealthy friends and maintain the illusion of a perfect family. That weekly requirement was going to provide my perfect window of opportunity. Sunday arrived with a heavy, relentless downpour of Seattle rain. I dressed in the modest, frumpy, and unflattering clothing Brenda always preferred me to wear. It constantly fed her towering ego to see me looking utterly exhausted and completely defeated next to her pristine elegance. I packed Lily into her car seat and organized her floral diaper bag with meticulous care. When we arrived at the massive estate, the psychological manipulation resumed immediately at the threshold. Brenda greeted us at the heavy double doors. She did not look at her granddaughter. She simply criticized the dark circles under my eyes and loudly told me I was completely failing to maintain my physical appearance for her son. Jason immediately abandoned us to drink expensive bourbon with his uncle in the formal drawing room. He played the role of the stressed, burdened provider flawlessly. Brenda marched away, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floors, to terrorize the private catering staff in the extensive kitchen. The house was loud, crowded, and full of wealthy, self-important guests. I stood in the grand foyer and announced to no one in particular that Lily was becoming fussy and desperately needed a quiet room to take a peaceful nap. Brenda waved a dismissive hand from the hallway, thoroughly disgusted by the prospect of a crying infant ruining her elegant social gathering. She sharply told me to go upstairs to the guest wing and stay completely out of sight until dinner was formally served. I did not go upstairs to the guest bedrooms. I walked silently down the long carpeted hallway on the main floor, moving swiftly away from the chaotic noise of the party and heading directly toward Brenda's private office wing. The heavy oak door was firmly locked, but Brenda always kept a spare brass key hidden beneath the soil of a fake potted orchid in the corridor. I retrieved the key, unlocked the heavy door, and slipped inside. The office smelled strongly of expensive leather and stale floral perfume. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tightly shut, plunging the room into deep shadows. I locked the door behind me and placed Lily safely on the wide leather sofa. I walked straight to the massive mahogany bookshelf covering the entire back wall. I reached behind a row of thick, leather-bound encyclopedias and pushed the hidden wooden latch I had noticed years ago while dusting. The large panel popped open smoothly, revealing the dull gray steel of the massive combination safe. My heart hammered a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I had a very limited window of time before someone noticed my prolonged absence or came looking for me. I stared at the digital keypad. The combination was the only barrier between me and the devastating evidence I needed to destroy them both. I knew Brenda was deeply and pathologically narcissistic. She would never use a random sequence of generated numbers. She would only use numbers that celebrated her own personal status and elevated her importance. I quickly typed in the date of her wedding anniversary. A red light flashed brightly, indicating a failure. I typed in Jason's date of birth. Another red error light illuminated the dark corner. My hands began to sweat. I closed my eyes and thought about the one day Brenda referenced more than any other. It was the exact day her late husband finalized the lucrative sale of his commercial enterprise, the day she officially became independently wealthy and socially untouchable. I punched the 6 digits of that historic financial date into the keypad. A bright green light flooded the dark space. The heavy steel bolts clicked back with a solid and immensely satisfying thud. I pulled the heavy metal door open. The interior of the safe was lined with soft black velvet. Resting on top of several velvet jewelry boxes were 3 exceptionally thick legal portfolios. I pulled them out and placed them on the desk, turning on a small brass reading lamp to examine the contents. My hands moved with practiced, desperate speed as I flipped through the dense pages of legal text. The headers on the documents were absolutely shocking. I had assumed the paperwork would only detail the ongoing theft of my personal assets and the strategy to steal my daughter, but the scope of their criminality was infinitely larger and far more sinister. Brenda and Jason had drafted incredibly complex investment contracts explicitly designed to systematically defraud Richard Sterling, the wealthy father of Jason's mistress. They were not just stealing my father's house. They were actively using their new illegitimate grandson as emotional leverage to siphon millions of dollars from the massive Sterling family trust into phantom shell companies that Brenda entirely controlled. The documents detailed a massive, highly illegal scheme involving fake vendor invoices, grossly inflated property valuations, and fraudulent corporate partnerships. My stolen life savings and my heavily mortgaged inherited home were merely the initial down payment to buy their way into the Sterling inner circle. Once they were completely trusted, they planned to bleed Lauren's powerful family completely dry. The sheer scale of the evil was breathtaking. They were destroying me to get to Lauren, and they were planning to destroy Lauren's family next. I absolutely needed these physical originals. Evelyn Carter needed these exact pages, with the original wet ink signatures to present to the federal authorities and guarantee decades in prison. I carefully folded the thick stack of premium paper. Suddenly, the heavy brass handle of the office door rattled loudly. My blood instantly turned to ice in my veins. Someone was actively trying to get in. I heard the distinctive, arrogant sound of Jason cursing under his breath in the hallway. He was loudly complaining that his mother always locked the good wine away, and muttering about finding the spare key in the hallway plant. He had come back to the office to retrieve a specific vintage bottle of wine Brenda kept stored in her private closet. He was literally 10 seconds away from walking into the room. I was completely trapped. The safe was wide open. The damning legal documents were clenched tightly in my hand. I looked around the room frantically for a hiding place, but there was nowhere to conceal a thick stack of rigid paper that he would not immediately search. My eyes landed on Lily. She was lying on the leather sofa, happily kicking her tiny legs in the air. Her floral diaper bag was sitting open on the rug right beside her. I did not have time to think logically. I moved purely on adrenaline and fierce maternal survival instinct. I grabbed my daughter and quickly unbuttoned her soft cotton onesie. I ripped open the adhesive tabs of her clean diaper. With violently trembling hands, I folded the stiff legal contracts into a tight, flat square. I shoved the thick packet of stolen documents directly inside the back lining of her diaper, pressing them flat against the thick, absorbent padding. I swiftly sealed the adhesive tabs tightly shut, completely concealing the paperwork against her lower back. I scooped her up into my arms and practically threw myself across the room. I kicked the heavy steel door of the safe shut with my foot. The metal bolts clicked into place a microsecond before the lock on the office door turned. Jason pushed the door open and stepped into the dim room. He froze instantly. His eyes narrowed with immediate and dark suspicion as they locked onto my face. He took a threatening step forward and demanded to know exactly what I was doing hiding in his mother's private study with the door locked. The air in the room became thick and suffocating. He looked at the desk, scanning the area for any sign that I had been snooping. His gaze drifted dangerously close to the bookshelf concealing the safe. My heart was beating so violently I thought he could surely hear it echoing in the quiet room. But my voice remained perfectly and unnaturally steady. I needed a distraction. I needed a completely visceral reaction that would override his intellectual suspicion. I shifted my weight, holding Lily securely against my chest. I subtly pinched the soft flesh of her thigh just hard enough to startle her. Lily let out a sudden, piercing wail that shattered the terrible tension in the room. I turned to Jason, my face twisted in a flawless mask of exhausted, overwhelmed distress. I told him we had a massive and disgusting diaper blowout. I claimed I was completely panicked and desperately needed the closest flat surface to clean her up away from the wealthy party guests. I held Lily out toward him, letting the pungent, very real smell of baby powder and the loud, chaotic reality of a crying infant hit his senses. I begged him to hold her for just a single minute so I could dig through the diaper bag to find the wipes and a fresh change of clothes. The psychological manipulation worked with absolute perfection. Jason recoiled instantly. The threatening posture of the suspicious interrogator completely vanished immediately, replaced by the sheer physical disgust of a man who absolutely refused to handle a dirty infant. He took 3 rapid steps backward, holding his hands up in a defensive gesture. He covered his nose with his sleeve and looked at us with unadulterated contempt. He sharply told me to handle the mess immediately and to clean the leather sofa before his mother found out what I was doing. He completely abandoned his search for the vintage wine. The only thing he wanted to do was escape the crying child and the impending mess. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted out the door, eager to return to the sterile comfort of his expensive bourbon and his wealthy relatives. I stood in the center of the dark office holding my daughter as her cries slowly subsided into soft hiccups. I let out a long, ragged breath that I felt I had been holding for an entire lifetime. My legs trembled so severely, I had to lean heavily against the mahogany desk to keep from collapsing onto the floor. I had looked the devil directly in the eye, and I had won. I quickly gathered the diaper bag and adjusted Lily in my arms. I walked out of the office, pulling the heavy oak door firmly shut behind me. I navigated the long hallway back toward the chaotic noise of the Sunday dinner party. I walked through the crowded living room, ignoring the disapproving glares of Brenda's wealthy friends. I politely told a passing caterer to inform my husband that the baby was unwell, and I was driving myself home immediately. I walked out the front door and into the pouring Seattle rain. When I finally reached my car, I strapped Lily safely into her car seat. I gently opened the back of her diaper and retrieved the tightly folded packet of legal documents. The heavy premium paper was completely unharmed and perfectly dry. I placed the documents carefully into the secure compartment of my leather handbag. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. I looked back at the massive, glowing estate through the rain-slicked windshield. Jason and Brenda thought they were the absolute masters of the game. They thought they had successfully orchestrated a brilliant conspiracy to strip me of my motherhood, steal my father's legacy, and bleed an empire dry. They believed I was a broken and defeated woman, sitting quietly in the shadows. They did not know that the quiet woman in the shadows had just stolen the master blueprint to their entire criminal enterprise. The evidence I had secured would ensure that neither of them would ever see the outside of a federal prison. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, driving steadily into the storm to deliver the final killing blow. The heavy glass doors of the law firm closed behind me, sealing out the noise of downtown Seattle. I carried my leather tote bag with a reverence usually reserved for handling fragile glass. Inside that bag, pressed safely between 2 rigid cardboard folders, lay the original documents I had extracted from Brenda's private safe. My heart beat with a steady, unyielding rhythm. 2 days ago, I had been a terrified woman hiding in a dark office, praying my daughter would not cry. Today, I was a mother walking into a war room with the exact ammunition needed to burn a monster to the ground. Evelyn Carter sat behind her massive mahogany desk, her sharp eyes studying my face as I pulled the original contracts out and laid them flat on the polished wood. She did not rush. She put on a pair of reading glasses and meticulously examined the thick premium paper, tracing the original wet ink signatures of my husband and my mother-in-law. The silence in the office stretched out, thick with anticipation, until Evelyn finally looked up, her expression transformed from professional curiosity to absolute predatory focus. She told me I had found something far more lethal than simple mortgage fraud. Evelyn turned the pages toward me and pointed to a series of complex financial routing numbers buried deep in the appendices of the limited liability company agreements. She explained that Jason and Brenda were not merely creating a shell company to steal my inherited house and siphon money from Lauren's wealthy father. The structure of the corporate accounts revealed a highly sophisticated mechanism designed for massive federal tax evasion. Jason had been systematically laundering his substantial corporate bonuses through fictitious offshore vendor accounts before funneling the money back into his domestic shell company. He was aggressively defrauding the Internal Revenue Service, hiding hundreds of thousands of dollars from federal taxation. Evelyn leaned back in her leather chair, steeled her hands together, and told me that while family court judges sometimes went easy on deceitful husbands, the federal government absolutely never forgave tax evasion. We were no longer just preparing a divorce filing. We were preparing a comprehensive financial crime complaint that would bring the full weight of federal authorities directly down on his head. I drove back to the suburbs feeling a profound sense of dangerous clarity. The legal trap was now officially fully constructed. Evelyn was moving swiftly, filing the divorce petition under a strict judicial seal to prevent Jason from receiving any premature notification. She was also coordinating directly with federal financial investigators, handing over the pristine mountain of evidence I had painstakingly gathered. All I had to do now was return to my quiet suburban house and play my assigned role of the broken, mentally fragile wife until the trap was ready to spring shut. I walked through my front door immediately, letting my shoulders slump forward. I wiped away my confident posture and replaced it with the shuffling, hesitant steps of a woman drowning in severe postpartum depression. That evening, Jason came home from work wearing a sickeningly bright smile. He walked into the kitchen where I was meticulously washing baby bottles, wrapped his arms around my waist, and kissed my cheek. The sheer physical proximity of him made my stomach violently turn, but I forced myself to lean into his embrace and sigh like a grateful wife. He told me he had some wonderful news that would instantly lift my spirits. He claimed that his mother Brenda had been doing a lot of soul-searching and wanted to make amends for her recent harsh behavior. He announced that Brenda had taken the liberty of organizing a beautiful, intimate baptism ceremony for Lily at their incredibly exclusive upscale church this coming Sunday. He spun a heartwarming tale about how the event would surround me with loving family members, how the community support would help heal my struggling mind, and how it was the perfect opportunity for us to truly celebrate our beautiful daughter. I kept my head bowed over the soapy sink water, listening to the smooth, convincing cadence of his voice. A normal woman would have been deeply touched by the gesture. A normal woman would have thanked him for his thoughtfulness. But I knew the man standing behind me was a calculating sociopath who viewed me as nothing more than a temporary logistical obstacle. I turned off the faucet, dried my hands on a towel, and looked up at him with wide, tearful eyes. I whispered that it sounded absolutely lovely. I thanked him for being so patient with my supposed mental struggles, and promised I would do my very best to make the day special for Lily. He smiled down at me, his eyes gleaming with dark, hidden triumph. He actually patted my head like I was a compliant pet, completely oblivious to the fact that he was patting the head of the woman who had just signed his federal prison sentence. The concept of Brenda organizing anything out of the goodness of her heart was utterly laughable. I knew there was a deeply malicious motive hidden beneath the pristine surface of this religious ceremony. I waited until the dead of night. Once the house fell into absolute silence and Jason began his heavy rhythmic snoring, I slipped out of bed. I moved silently down the hallway, bypassing his secured computer, and instead accessed his synchronized tablet, which he carelessly left charging on the kitchen counter. My fingers moved swiftly across the glowing glass screen, diving straight into his private email correspondence with his mother and Lauren's wealthy family. What I found in those digital folders was so profoundly evil, it temporarily stopped the breath in my lungs. The baptism was a complete and absolute sham. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical trap designed to eliminate me from society in front of an audience of the most powerful people in the city. The guest list Jason had approved did not consist of our mutual friends or supportive neighbors. The guest list included the entire board of directors from his firm, dozens of elite country club members, and the entirety of Lauren's incredibly wealthy extended family. Lauren herself, having magically recovered enough from her critical hospital stay, was listed as a guest of honor. The emails between Jason and Brenda laid out a horrifying step-by-step choreography for the coming Sunday. They planned to use the religious gathering to publicly unveil Lauren to his social circle, subtly positioning her as his true partner while I was still standing in the room. But their plan for me was infinitely more sinister. Dr. Arthur Vance, the corrupt clinical psychologist they had brought to my home, was specifically invited to attend the event. The emails explicitly detailed their intention to mentally push me until I broke. They planned to have Brenda and Lauren corner me during the post-baptism reception, using whispered insults and aggressive psychological manipulation to trigger a massive hysterical reaction. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to cry and lash out in front of 200 wealthy witnesses. Once I had the expected emotional breakdown, Dr. Vance was instructed to immediately step forward and publicly declare that my severe postpartum psychosis had reached a critical and highly dangerous peak. They had an actual private ambulance company on standby paid for in advance by Brenda. Their ultimate goal was to have me physically restrained and hauled away to a locked psychiatric facility directly from the church reception. This spectacular public removal would immediately secure Jason the absolute sympathy of his elite social circle. He would be viewed as the tragic, heroic father struggling to protect his newborn daughter from a violently insane mother. It would completely validate his emergency custody petition and provide the perfect tragic excuse for him to immediately move Lauren into the role of the new stable mother figure. They were going to use a sacred church and the baptism of my innocent daughter as a theatrical stage to completely assassinate my character and steal my life. I sat in the dark kitchen staring at the glowing tablet screen, feeling a cold wave of absolute clarity wash through my veins. They possessed absolutely no boundaries, no morals, and no basic human decency. They viewed human beings as disposable props in their own selfish play. The sheer arrogance required to plot a fake baptism just to publicly destroy a mother was staggering. I carefully forwarded every single one of those damning emails directly to Evelyn Carter. I provided my lawyer with the exact timeline, the guest list, and the horrible details of their premeditated ambush. I did not panic. I did not shed a single tear over their monstrous cruelty. Instead, a deep, powerful sense of anticipation took root in my chest. If Jason and Brenda wanted to throw a massive, highly publicized social event to celebrate their deceptive victories, I was more than happy to attend. If they desperately wanted a spectacular public performance, I was going to give them the performance of an absolute lifetime. The next 48 hours were a masterpiece of silent, deadly preparation. I spoke with Evelyn Carter extensively on my secure mobile line, while pretending to take long, quiet walks around the neighborhood with Lily in her stroller. Evelyn was utterly appalled by the contents of the emails. But as a former federal prosecutor, she knew exactly how to turn their theatrical trap into a legal slaughterhouse. She quietly arranged for specialized federal agents from the Financial Crimes Division to review the exact timing of the event. She confirmed that local law enforcement had been discreetly briefed regarding Dr. Vance and his fraudulent medical credentials. We meticulously orchestrated our counterattack to coincide exactly with the climax of their fake religious celebration. Meanwhile, inside the walls of my suburban prison, I continued to play the role of the docile broken sheep. I allowed Brenda to come over and dictate exactly what Lily would wear for the ceremony. I stood silently in the living room while Brenda held up a dull, lifeless gray dress for me, claiming it was the only garment that would appropriately hide my terrible postpartum figure. I simply nodded, took the ugly dress from her hands, and thanked her for her generosity in a soft, defeated whisper. Jason watched from his armchair, sipping his bourbon, thoroughly enjoying the sight of his wife being completely humiliated by his mother. He thought he had utterly broken my spirit. He thought I was blindly walking directly into the slaughter. On Saturday night, the eve of the Great Reckoning, I stood alone in the nursery. The house was completely quiet. I looked down at Lily sleeping peacefully under her soft pink blanket. I reached out and gently traced the curve of her tiny cheek. She was entirely innocent, completely unaware of the massive storm that was about to break over our lives. I leaned down and whispered a quiet promise into the dark room. I promised my daughter that nobody would ever use her as a pawn. I promised her that the people who tried to steal her mother and destroy our future would never see the light of day again. I walked to my closet and pulled out the dull gray dress Brenda had forced upon me. I threw it directly into the bottom of the trash can. I reached into the very back of the closet and retrieved a stunning, perfectly tailored emerald green dress I had bought years ago for a gala we never attended. I laid it out on the bed. Tomorrow I would not be the pathetic, crazy victim they designed me to be. Tomorrow I would walk into that church with my head held high. I would let them gather all their wealthy friends, their powerful business partners, and their corrupt doctors into one singular room. I would let them raise their glasses and prepare to strike. And then I would systematically tear their entire fraudulent empire to the ground, piece by piece, until there was absolutely nothing left but ashes. The stage was perfectly set, the actors were all entirely unaware of the new script, and the curtain was finally ready to rise. The morning of the baptism arrived with brilliant, piercing sunlight that felt entirely out of place for the dark reality of my marriage. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom and smoothed the fabric of the emerald green dress. It fit perfectly, wrapping me in a color of strength and renewal. I paired it with simple gold earrings and styled my hair in an elegant twist. When I walked down the curved staircase holding my daughter, who was dressed in a pristine white lace gown, Jason was waiting in the foyer. The smug, satisfied smile on his face faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw me. He had expected the broken, exhausted woman in baggy sweatpants. He quickly recovered, adjusting his expensive silk tie, completely unaware that his entire world was about to collapse. We drove to the historic stone church in absolute silence. The parking lot was filled with luxury vehicles, a clear indication that Brenda had spared absolutely no expense for her grand theatrical performance. Walking through the heavy oak doors of the sanctuary, I was immediately struck by the sheer scale of their deception. There were roughly 80 guests gathered in the vaulted space. These were not our neighbors, or my quiet circle of friends. The pews were filled with corporate executives, country club socialites, and the most influential figures in Seattle high society. And sitting prominently in the second row, dressed in an understated but incredibly expensive cream suit, was Lauren. My breath caught in my throat for just a moment. Beside Lauren sat her wealthy parents, Richard and Evelyn Sterling. And resting in Lauren's arms, swaddled in pale blue cashmere, was her premature baby boy. The sheer audacity of bringing his mistress and his illegitimate son to my daughter's baptism was staggering. Jason guided me to the front pew with a firm, controlling hand on the small of my back. I sat down holding Lily close to my chest and let my eyes sweep over the congregation. I saw Dr. Arthur Vance, the corrupt psychologist, sitting near the aisle, his face a mask of professional concern. He was waiting for his cue. He was waiting for me to shatter. I took a deep, steadying breath. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of a breakdown. I was going to give them an execution. The religious ceremony itself was a blur of holy water, quiet prayers, and solemn promises. Jason stood beside me at the baptismal font, playing the role of the devoted patriarch with sickening perfection. He smiled at the priest. He placed a gentle hand on Lily's head. He looked out at the congregation with the pious humility of a saint. I watched him perform, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. When the sacred rites concluded, the guests transitioned to the opulent fellowship hall attached to the sanctuary. It was a massive room with soaring ceilings currently filled with catered buffet tables, towering floral arrangements, and an enormous digital projector screen set up against the back wall. The screen was supposed to display a charming slideshow of Lily's first weeks at home, a presentation Brenda had insisted on managing herself. My lawyer, Evelyn, had ensured that the audiovisual technician hired for the event received a highly confidential alternate flash drive the night before. The guests mingled, their voices rising in a wealthy, privileged hum. Jason left my side immediately to fetch drinks, conveniently migrating toward the section of the room where the Sterling family had gathered. I stood alone near the front, holding my sleeping daughter, watching the predators circle. A sharp tap on a microphone pierced the chatter. The room fell silent as Brenda stepped up to the wooden podium. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that screamed authority and wealth. Her face was arranged into a carefully practiced expression of deep maternal sorrow. She gripped the edges of the podium and looked out over the crowd, intentionally avoiding my eyes. "Thank you all for being here today, to welcome my beautiful granddaughter Lily into the faith," Brenda began, her voice echoing through the large hall. "As many of you know, bringing a new life into the world is supposed to be a joyous occasion. But for my son Jason, this journey has been marked by profound hardship and unimaginable tragedy." A collective murmur rippled through the wealthy crowd. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lauren looked up, her expression a mix of sympathy and quiet triumph. Brenda let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "I feel it is my duty as a mother to speak the truth today. We are a family that values honesty above all else. For the past month, my son has been carrying a burden no man should ever have to bear alone. He has been silently struggling to protect his newborn child from the very person who should be nurturing her." She paused, letting the silence amplify her malicious words. She looked directly at Dr. Vance, who nodded solemnly in return. "Chloe has been suffering from severe, untreatable postpartum depression," Brenda announced to the horrified room. "Her mental state has rapidly deteriorated into a dangerous psychosis. She is completely detached from reality. She suffers from violent mood swings and has shown a terrifying tendency to endanger her own child. Jason has tried everything. He has sacrificed his career, his sleep, and his own well-being to keep his daughter safe from a mentally unstable wife." The gasps from the audience were audible. People were staring at me with a mixture of pity, disgust, and outright fear. Jason stood near the back, looking down at his shoes, playing the tragic hero to absolute perfection. They had laid the trap exactly as the emails had detailed. This was the moment I was supposed to scream. This was the moment I was supposed to run toward the podium, crying and denying everything, proving their exact point to every influential person in the room. I did not scream. I did not cry. I handed my sleeping daughter to the trusted longtime nanny I had personally hired and briefed earlier that morning. I smoothed the fabric of my emerald dress, stood up straight, and walked slowly and deliberately toward the front of the room. The crowd parted for me instinctively. The loud murmurs died down into a tense, suffocating silence. Brenda saw me approaching, and her confident posture faltered. She gripped the microphone tightly, her knuckles turning white. "Chloe, please," Brenda said, her voice dripping with fake, desperate concern. "You are unwell. Please do not make a scene. Dr. Vance is here to help you. We have an ambulance waiting outside to take you to a safe facility." I reached the podium. I did not try to rip the microphone from her hands. I simply stood beside her, looking at her with a calm, terrifying emptiness. I reached out and took hold of the microphone stand. I leaned in close to her ear, ensuring no one else could hear my words. "You are going to step away from this podium right now," I whispered softly, "or I will have you arrested for extortion and fraud before the caterers serve dessert." Brenda turned completely pale. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The supreme arrogance melted from her eyes, replaced instantly by a primal crawling fear. She released the microphone and took a clumsy, stumbling step backward. I adjusted the microphone to my height. I looked out over the sea of 80 faces. I saw Jason pushing his way through the crowd, panic finally registering on his handsome features. He knew something had gone wrong. He just did not know how catastrophically wrong it was about to get. "Thank you, Brenda, for that dramatic introduction," I said, my voice projecting loud and clear across the fellowship hall. "I assure you all that my mental health is perfectly intact. In fact, my mind has never been clearer than it is at this exact moment." I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small remote control the audiovisual technician had discreetly handed me when I arrived. I pointed it at the back wall and pressed the primary button. The massive digital projector screen flared to life behind me. The room gasped in unison. It was not a charming slideshow of a newborn baby. The image displayed on the 10-foot screen was a crystal-clear, high-resolution photograph. It showed Jason standing in the dim hallway of the neonatal intensive care unit. He was slumped against the wall, weeping openly into the shoulder of Evelyn Sterling, Lauren's mother. Lauren's father, Richard Sterling, stood beside them, looking grim and supportive. "Brenda claims her son has been carrying a tragic burden," I continued, my voice echoing off the stone walls. "And she is absolutely right. But his burden has nothing to do with my mental health. His burden is the massive, exhaustive effort required to manage two entirely separate families." Chaos erupted in the hall. Voices escalated into shouts of confusion and shock. I pressed the button again. The next slide was a short, silent video clip I had taken from the shadows. It showed the doctor emerging from the intensive care unit, telling Jason that his son was safe, but that Lauren was bleeding internally. The subtitles I had meticulously added to the video rolled across the bottom of the screen, spelling out the undeniable truth for every single guest to read. Jason froze in the middle of the room. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. He stared at the massive screen, his mouth hanging open in absolute terror. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Richard Sterling. Mr. Sterling was a man who commanded boardrooms and built empires. The look on his face as he realized what he was watching was purely murderous. He looked at Jason, then looked at the screen, and the devastating reality crashed down upon him. The man who had fathered his beloved daughter's child was a married man. A man who had abandoned his legal wife while she was actively giving birth in the exact same hospital to sit and cry over his mistress. Lauren let out a high-pitched, hysterical sob. She pulled her swaddled son tight against her chest and buried her face in her hands. The entire social circle, the very people Jason had desperately wanted to impress and conquer, were now staring at him with unadulterated disgust. But I was not finished. Exposing the affair was merely the appetizer. I wanted his absolute destruction. I pressed the remote again. The images of the hospital vanished. They were replaced by a massive, undeniable spreadsheet. It was a blown-up, highlighted bank statement from our joint savings account. "We are a family that values honesty," Brenda said just moments ago. I projected my voice over the rising clamor of the crowd. "So let us look at some honest numbers. What you are looking at is the systematic draining of my personal life savings. Over $120,000 stolen piece by piece over the last 8 months. I clicked the remote. The screen changed to the state business registry filing. It displayed the corporate details of the limited liability company. I highlighted the names of the primary corporate officers, Lauren Sterling and Jason Myers. Lauren's father let out a roar of absolute fury. He lunged toward Jason, grabbing him roughly by the collar of his suit. "You dragged my daughter into a fraud scheme," Richard Sterling shouted, his voice booming over the chaos. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen filled with the forged quitclaim deed to my late father's house, complete with my deliberately misspelled jagged signature. My husband did not just steal my cash to fund his new luxury lifestyle, I announced, ensuring every executive and lawyer in the room heard me perfectly. He committed massive federal mortgage fraud. He forged my signature to leverage my deceased father's home to pay for his new mansion. And he brought Dr. Vance here today to falsely diagnose me with psychosis, so he could lock me in a psychiatric ward, steal my daughter, and silence me forever. The silence that followed was total and absolute. It was the silence of a room realizing they had just been made unwitting accomplices to a monstrous criminal conspiracy. Dr. Arthur Vance, the corrupt psychologist, turned and literally ran out the back doors of the church, desperate to escape the severe legal ramifications of his false diagnosis. Jason finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, broken sound. "Chloe, please," he begged, holding his hands out toward me. "You do not understand. I can explain all of this. Please turn that off." I looked down at him from the podium. The man who had ignored my agony. The man who had stolen my future, the man who had tried to erase my motherhood, looked small and utterly defeated. "There is nothing left to explain, Jason," I said calmly. "My lawyer has already submitted these exact documents to the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The fraud investigators are reviewing your offshore tax evasion right now." Jason collapsed onto his knees in the middle of the church floor. He grabbed his hair, rocking back and forth as his entire world shattered into irreparable pieces. Brenda was backed against the wall, weeping hysterically, her social standing completely and permanently annihilated. I stepped down from the podium. I did not look back at the screen or the ruined family crying on the floor. I walked calmly down the center aisle, retrieved my sleeping daughter from my nanny, and walked out the heavy oak doors into the bright afternoon sunlight. I had faced the monsters in the dark, and I had burned their entire world to the ground. The fellowship hall was a cauldron of frantic whispers and sharp gasps. The massive projector screen behind me blazed with the undeniable proof of my husband's absolute moral bankruptcy. For a single heartbeat, Jason remained on his knees on the polished hardwood floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his public exposure. But the paralysis did not last. The deep, creeping realization that his perfectly curated life was evaporating in real time triggered a sudden and violent shift in his demeanor. The pathetic, weeping facade vanished instantly. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He scrambled to his feet, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the smooth floor, and lunged directly toward the wooden podium. He let out a guttural, furious shout, completely abandoning his sophisticated corporate persona. He reached out with both hands, desperate to tear the microphone from my grip and smash the remote control into pieces. He desperately wanted to plunge the room back into darkness and silence the truth. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I stood my ground, anchoring my feet to the floor, entirely ready to defend myself. But I did not have to lift a single finger. Before Jason could close the 5 feet of space between us, a massive figure stepped directly into his path. It was Richard Sterling. Lauren's father moved with terrifying speed for a man of his age. He shoved his hands hard against Jason's chest, violently pushing my husband backward. Jason stumbled and crashed into a lavishly decorated catering table, sending crystal water glasses shattering across the hardwood floor. The sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted ceiling. Richard Sterling stood over him, his face flushed with a terrifying aristocratic fury. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Jason. "You arrogant, lying parasite," Mr. Sterling roared. His voice easily overpowered the frantic whispers of the wealthy congregation. "You looked me directly in the eye and told me you were a highly successful corporate executive. You asked for my blessing. You promised me you were providing a secure, independent life for my daughter and my grandson." Jason held his hands up defensively, stammering out fractured, incoherent excuses. He tried to claim that the bank statements on the screen were entirely fabricated. He tried to say it was all a massive, hysterical misunderstanding. But Richard Sterling was not a man who could be easily manipulated. He was a seasoned titan of industry who understood financial documents better than anyone in that room. He gestured fiercely toward the massive projector screen, specifically pointing at the forged quitclaim deed and the staggering bank transfer logs. "You bought that multi-million-dollar estate with stolen money," Mr. Sterling yelled, his voice echoing with absolute disgust. "You did not use your lucrative corporate bonuses. You did not use your investment portfolios. You actively drained your wife's life savings, and you illegally mortgaged a dead man's house just to impress my family. You are completely broke, Jason. You are nothing but a common pathetic thief." Across the room, Lauren let out a piercing, devastated cry. She was sitting in the second row, clutching her swaddled newborn son against her chest, as if trying to shield him from the toxic fallout of his father's crimes. She looked at Jason with wide, horrified eyes. The polished, upper-class illusion she had fallen for had just been violently stripped away, revealing a hollow and deeply indebted criminal. She realized in that exact moment that the luxurious mansion she had just moved into was not a testament to Jason's love or his profound success. It was the direct result of a monstrous financial crime committed against a woman who had just given birth to his other child. Evelyn Sterling wrapped her arms protectively around her weeping daughter, glaring at Jason with a hatred so profound it could have easily turned him to stone. Brenda, realizing that her ultimate dream of permanently merging her family with the elite Sterling dynasty was currently burning to the ground, frantically pushed her way to the front of the room. She grabbed Richard Sterling's sleeve, her manicured fingers trembling violently. "Richard, please, you must carefully listen to reason," Brenda pleaded, her voice pitched high and desperate. He only did this because he loves Lauren so much. He desperately wanted to provide the beautiful life she rightfully deserves. This woman, Brenda, pointed a shaking finger directly at me, was completely holding him back. She is severely unstable. She is trying to ruin his bright future out of pure malicious jealousy. Richard Sterling slowly turned his head and looked at Brenda with an expression of absolute freezing contempt. He yanked his arm away from her grasp as if her touch was physically repulsive. "Do not ever speak to me again," he said, his words dropping like heavy blocks of ice. "You knew all about this. You actively conspired to use stolen funds to infiltrate my family. You think because you wear expensive pearls and host fancy Sunday dinners that you belong in our social circle. You are significantly worse than he is. You are a disgusting, pathetic enabler who proudly helped steal an inheritance from a grieving daughter." Brenda physically recoiled, the brutal social rejection landing like a physical blow to her chest. She opened her mouth to argue, to desperately spin another web of lies, but the heavy iron reinforced double doors at the absolute rear of the fellowship hall swung open with a resounding heavy crash. The entire congregation turned their heads in perfect unison. The bright afternoon sunlight poured into the room, silhouetting a strict line of stern, imposing figures stepping over the threshold. They were not late arriving guests. They were uniformed police officers flanked closely by 4 individuals wearing sharp, professional business suits and carrying thick leather portfolios. The bright silver badges clipped securely to their belts caught the ambient light. The room instantly plunged into a dead, terrified silence. Even the wealthiest and most arrogant people in the room instinctively held their breath. When federal authorities walk into a room, the atmosphere changes on a molecular level. Evelyn Carter, my brilliant and deeply strategic attorney, walked in directly behind them, her face arranged in a mask of absolute professional triumph. She had timed their dramatic arrival flawlessly. The lead investigator, a tall woman with sharp features and an unyielding posture, walked directly down the center aisle. She completely bypassed the shocked socialites and the whispering executives, keeping her eyes firmly locked on my husband. Jason took a hesitant step backward, his back hitting the stone wall of the church. The arrogance and the violent rage completely drained from his body, replaced instantly by the primal trembling fear of a trapped animal. Jason Myers, the lead investigator, announced, her voice calm, but carrying absolute authority. "We are here to officially execute a federal warrant for your immediate arrest." The words hit the room like an explosive charge. Jason shook his head wildly, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. "You are making a terrible mistake," he stammered, his voice cracking with panic. "This is just a petty domestic dispute. My wife is just incredibly angry. She is mentally unwell, and she is making all of this up to ruin me." The investigator did not even blink. She opened the leather portfolio in her hand and extracted a clear plastic evidence sleeve containing the physical quitclaim deed he had proudly filed just a few days ago. "We do not arrest people based on marital disputes, Mr. Myers," she said coolly. "We arrest them for aggravated wire fraud, grand larceny, and severe federal mortgage fraud. You submitted a formal legal document to a banking institution and a county clerk to explicitly extract hundreds of thousands of dollars against a property you absolutely do not own." Jason pointed a desperate, shaking finger at the document in her hand. "But she signed it," he shouted, his voice echoing frantically in the vaulted ceiling. "Look at the paper." Chloe voluntarily signed the power of attorney. She authorized the entire transfer. She gave me the legal right to secure that specific loan. This was the singular moment I had been waiting for since that dark, terrifying night in his study. I leaned into the microphone on the podium, making absolutely sure my voice reached every single corner of the quiet room. "I did not sign that document, Jason," I said calmly. He whipped his head around to stare at me, his eyes wide with desperate confusion. "Yes, you did," he yelled. "I watched you do it right at the kitchen table. You were crying. You deliberately signed the bottom line." I smiled. It was not a smile of joy, but a smile of absolute icy victory. "You watched a woman write a name on a piece of paper," I corrected him softly. "But you were far too arrogant and far too eager to steal my money to actually look at what was written. I am naturally right-handed, Jason." I held the pen awkwardly with my middle and ring fingers. I completely changed the slant and the pressure of the strokes. And if you had bothered to actually read the signature you were using to commit massive federal fraud, you would have noticed that I intentionally swapped the vowels in my own last name. The profound realization hit him with a visible physical force. His eyes darted rapidly to the plastic sleeve in the investigator's hand. The federal agent nodded slowly. "The signature is a catastrophic mismatch, Mr. Myers," the agent confirmed. "It does not match a single piece of verified identification on file. The deliberate misspelling renders the document completely fraudulent on its very face. The notary public who illegally stamped this document without ever verifying the signature has already been detained and has provided a full sworn confession regarding your illicit arrangement." Jason literally collapsed against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor amid the shattered crystal glass of the catering table. His breathing was rapid and terribly shallow. The masterful illusion he had spent an entire year building had been completely dismantled by a single, deliberately misspelled word. He had willingly handed the federal government the exact, irrefutable proof they needed to prove his intent to commit fraud, but the authorities were not finished. Two agents in dark suits stepped purposefully toward the corner, where Brenda was trying desperately to blend into the shadows. "Brenda Myers." A male agent said, his voice cutting through her panicked silence. "We also have a federal warrant for your arrest." Brenda let out a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. "What are you talking about?" she cried out, backing away as the officers approached her. "I have done absolutely nothing wrong. I am simply a concerned grandmother trying to help my son. I am a highly respected member of this community. You are the primary registered owner and controlling officer of the limited liability company known as L&J. Future, the agent stated, reading clearly from a printed warrant. You actively conspired with your son to funnel stolen domestic funds through offshore vendor accounts to aggressively evade federal taxation. The Internal Revenue Service takes a very dim view of complex money laundering schemes explicitly designed to hide hundreds of thousands of dollars from the federal government. Brenda began to thrash wildly as the officers reached for her arms. She screamed that it was all a terrible mistake, that she was being maliciously framed, that she demanded to call her private attorney immediately. The officers ignored her hysterical protests. They smoothly and efficiently turned her around, pulling her arms firmly behind her back. The sharp, metallic click of steel handcuffs echoing through the silent church was the most beautiful and satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The entire congregation watched the scene in absolute paralyzed horror. The wealthy country club socialites, the elite board members, the powerful executives Brenda had spent decades desperately trying to impress were now staring at her with complete and utter disgust. Her entire social standing, the only thing she truly valued in this world, was being publicly pulverized. She was being hauled out of a sacred church in federal handcuffs, permanently exposed to the entire city as a common, desperate criminal. The local police officers hauled Jason up from the floor. They pulled his arms behind his back and secured the steel cuffs tightly around his wrists. He did not fight them. He looked completely hollowed out, a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant man who had ignored my labor pains just a few short weeks ago. As they began to lead Jason down the center aisle, he passed directly by Lauren and her family. He stopped, digging his heels firmly into the floor, and looked at the woman he had destroyed his life to secure. "Lauren, please," he begged, hot tears streaming down his face. "I love you so much. I did all of this for us. I did it to build a future for our son. Please tell them the truth. Please help me." Richard Sterling stepped squarely in front of his daughter, entirely blocking Jason's view of Lauren and the newborn baby. He looked at Jason with eyes completely devoid of mercy. "You will never speak to my daughter again," Richard stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble. "You will never come anywhere near this child again. My legal team will ensure that your parental rights are permanently and entirely severed before you even have the chance to post bail. You do not exist to this family anymore. You are absolutely nothing to us." Lauren did not even look at him. She turned her back completely, burying her face against her mother's shoulder, weeping bitterly for the luxurious illusion she had lost. The police officers firmly pushed Jason forward, forcing him to walk the long, humiliating path toward the exit. He was paraded directly past his wealthy bosses, his judgmental peers, and the deeply shocked pastor. I stood confidently at the wooden podium and watched them go. The heavy oak doors at the back of the church opened wide, revealing the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers waiting patiently in the parking lot. I watched as Jason and Brenda were shoved unceremoniously into the back seats of separate vehicles. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel an ounce of regret. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of clean, quiet peace. They had tried to take away my child, my sanity, and my home. Instead, they had handed me the absolute power to reclaim my life. The storm had finally broken, the air was clear, and I was exactly where I was always meant to be. The dust from the shattered illusion of my marriage did not settle overnight. When you detonate a bomb in the center of an elite social circle, the shockwaves ripple outward for months. Sitting here today in the quiet warmth of my own living room, watching the morning sunlight spill across the hardwood floors, that chaotic Sunday at the church feels like a lifetime ago. I am 28 years old, but I possess the hard-earned wisdom of a woman who walked through a blazing fire and emerged entirely untouched. The storm that Jason and Brenda tried to drown me in ended up being the very thing that washed them away completely. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding inevitability, but when it finally locks onto a target, it is absolutely merciless. Jason, arrogant, tailored, utterly convinced of his own supreme intelligence, learned this lesson in the harshest way possible. Following the spectacle at the baptism, the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Financial Crimes Division descended upon his life like a swarm of locusts. The pristine, encrypted files I had extracted from his computer and Brenda's safe provided a flawless, irrefutable roadmap of his criminal enterprise. There was no room for highly paid defense attorneys to spin a sympathetic narrative. The paper trail was absolute. Jason tried to negotiate. He tried to offer up his business partners, desperately attempting to trade confidential corporate secrets for a reduced sentence. But the prosecutors were not interested in his bargains. They had him dead to rights on aggravated wire fraud, massive tax evasion, through his offshore vendor accounts, and severe mortgage fraud. I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the federal courthouse on the day of his sentencing. I wore a simple navy suit, holding my head high. I watched as the judge, a stern man who had zero patience for white-collar criminals, looked down from the bench with absolute disgust. The judge noted that Jason had not only defrauded the federal government, but had callously exploited his own wife and newborn daughter to fund his greed. When the gavel fell, Jason was sentenced to 72 months in a federal penitentiary, 6 years behind concrete walls and iron bars. The man who had refused to hold his own daughter because he was afraid of dropping her, the man who had complained about the inconvenience of my 14-hour labor, was now stripped of his expensive suits, his luxury watches, and his prestigious corporate titles. He was led out of the courtroom in a standard-issue jumpsuit, his hands secured in heavy steel cuffs. He looked back at me one final time before the heavy wooden doors closed behind him. There was no arrogance left in his eyes. There was only the hollow, terrified realization that he had engineered his own complete destruction. His mother, Brenda, met a fate that was perhaps even more poetic in its absolute devastation. For her entire adult life, Brenda had worshipped at the altar of high society. She had measured human worth entirely by bank balances, exclusive country club memberships, and the sprawling square footage of Mercer Island estates. She had sneered at my modest background and actively plotted to have me locked in a psychiatric ward just so she could upgrade her family pedigree. But Brenda had made a fatal error when she allowed her name to be listed as the controlling officer of the limited liability company Jason used to launder his stolen money. The federal government does not distinguish between the architect of a tax evasion scheme and the willing accomplice who signs the corporate charters. As the financial investigations deepened, the authorities froze every single one of Brenda's assets. Her sprawling estate, the one with the grand foyer and the hidden wall safe, where I had secured my victory, was seized and liquidated by the government to cover the staggering penalties and back taxes owed by their fraudulent corporation. But the government was only the beginning of her ruin. Desperate to keep her precious son out of prison, Brenda had hired a team of the most ruthless, expensive criminal defense attorneys on the West Coast. The legal fees drained whatever legitimate funds she had managed to hide. Within 8 months, her vast retirement accounts were completely exhausted. Her elite circle of wealthy friends, the same people who had witnessed her humiliating arrest at the church, abandoned her instantly. In the ruthless world of high society, criminal indictments are a fatal contagion, and no one wanted to be associated with a convicted fraudster. Today, the woman who once demanded I be thrown out of a hospital bed to save her a few pennies lives in a cramped, outdated mobile home on the dreary outskirts of Tacoma. She has no staff. She has no caterers. She has no wealthy daughter-in-law to parade around at Sunday dinners. Richard Sterling Lauren's powerful father kept his absolute promise. He deployed his own massive legal team to ensure Jason's name was completely erased from their lives, taking Lauren and the infant boy far away to the East Coast. Brenda lost her entire social empire, her freedom, and the grandson she had been so desperately obsessed with. She is entirely alone, surrounded only by thin metal walls, and the bitter, suffocating memory of her own monstrous hubris. While their world crumbled into ash, my world was being meticulously and beautifully rebuilt. The family court proceedings were a swift and brutal victory. Because Jason was facing serious federal prison time and had been conclusively proven to be a severe flight risk and an active danger to our family's financial security, the judge granted me 100% sole physical and legal custody of Lily. Jason was entirely stripped of his parental rights. He will never have the authority to make a single decision regarding her education, her healthcare, or her future. My brilliant attorney, Evelyn Carter, systematically untangled the complex web of fraud Jason had wrapped around my life. We presented the definitive proof of the forged, misspelled quitclaim deed to the county recording office and the lending institution. Because the notary public confessed to the illegal stamping, the fraudulent secondary mortgage on my late father's house was completely nullified. The crushing debt was erased, the illegal liens were permanently removed, and the clean, unburdened title was rightfully restored to my name. I held the heavy brass keys to my father's house in my hands and wept tears of profound relief. His legacy was safe, completely untouched by the greedy hands of the man who tried to steal it. We also successfully petitioned the courts to recover the $120,000 Jason had drained from our joint savings account. The stolen funds were seized from the liquidated assets of their sham corporation and wired directly back into a secure, single-name account that only I control. But the universe has a fascinating way of rewarding those who step out of the shadows and fight for the truth. Several months after Jason's federal conviction, I received a thick official envelope from the United States Department of the Treasury. Because I had voluntarily come forward and provided the Internal Revenue Service with the exact, highly detailed corporate documents and the explicit offshore vendor routing numbers that exposed a massive tax evasion ring, I qualified for the Federal Whistleblower Reward Program. The government offers a substantial percentage of the recovered fraudulent funds to the individual who provides the crucial evidence. When I opened the envelope and looked at the certified government check inside, my breath actually caught in my throat. It was a sum of money large enough to completely guarantee my daughter's college education, pay off any remaining debts, and secure a wildly comfortable future for us both. The very financial scheme Jason had built to leave me destitute had directly funded my ultimate financial independence. The emotional resolution of this journey, however, is worth far more than any government check or restored property deed. I am sitting here in the nursery right now. The walls are painted a soft, calming shade of yellow. The afternoon light is pouring through the clean glass windows, casting a warm, golden glow over the plush rocking chair and the overflowing baskets of colorful toys. Lily is awake. She is sitting on her soft playmat, happily babbling to a stuffed elephant, her bright eyes wide and taking in the beautiful world around her. She is healthy, she is strong, and she is absolutely thriving. I watch her tiny hands grasp the plush fabric of the toy, and a fierce, overwhelming wave of love washes through my entire body. I think back to that freezing hospital room, to the moment her father backed away from her in disgust, treating her existence as a terrible inconvenience. He had viewed her as the wrong child. He had looked at her innocent face and seen only an obstacle standing in the way of his wealth and his mistress. She will never know that feeling. She will never know what it is like to look into a parent's eyes and see cold, calculating rejection. She will never have to shrink herself down to fit into a space designed by a narcissist. She is growing up in a home that is entirely defined by peace, stability, and unconditional affection. I am her mother, and I am her absolute protector. I fought through a terrifying labyrinth of deceit, psychological manipulation, and financial ruin to ensure that she would only ever know what it feels like to be fiercely and completely loved. The trauma of the past is behind us. The anxiety that used to tightly grip my chest every time I heard a key turn in the front door has completely vanished. Our home is a sanctuary. The air is light. The future is a wide-open horizon that we get to paint with our own colors. I went from being a compliant, invisible wife who accepted emotional starvation to a woman who single-handedly dismantled a criminal conspiracy and reclaimed her rightful legacy. I learned that true strength does not roar. It plans, it waits, and it executes with flawless precision. Family love cannot be a shield for exploitation. We are often taught to swallow our pain, to ignore the glaring red flags, and to compromise our own sanity just to keep the peace and maintain the illusion of a happy home. But keeping the peace with toxic people only guarantees that you will remain at war with yourself. Do not ever let anyone convince you that your boundaries are an act of betrayal. Do not let anyone diagnose you, diminish you, or dictate your worth. Never turn a blind eye to a mother's intuition. When that quiet, persistent voice in the back of your mind tells you that something is terribly wrong, you must listen to it. It is not paranoia. It is your deepest survival instinct trying to keep you safe. I ignored my intuition for 9 months, desperately trying to believe the lies because the truth was too painful to confront. But the truth will set you free, even if it has to burn your entire world to the ground first. If you have ever been betrayed by the person you trusted most, if you have ever had to rebuild your life from the ashes of someone else's greed, comment the word strength below so we can share our journeys. You are never as trapped as the manipulators want you to believe. You hold the pen, and you can write a new ending whenever you are ready. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more true stories of resilience, and let me know which state you are watching from in the comments below. See you in the next story.